الله أكبر الله أكبر.
Alhamdulillah. We begin with the greetings. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Alhamdulillah nahmaduhu wa nasta'inuhu wa nastaghfiruhu wa natubu ilayh wa na'udhu billahi min shururi anfusina wa min sayyiati a'malina. Man yahdihillahu fahuwal muhtad wa man yudlil fala hadiya lahu. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. Praise is due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We praise Him, we seek help and assistance from Him, we ask forgiveness from Him, and we repent to Him and seek refuge in Him from the evil actions that we engage in and from the consequences of our evil deeds. Surely anyone who is guided by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then he indeed has been guided, and if anyone has been left astray, then he will find no one to guide him other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I bear witness that there is only one God, that there is no God worthy of worship except for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the only one without any partner. And I bear witness that Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, peace and blessings be upon him, is his servant and his final messenger. From abad to what proceeds. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu taqullaha haqqa tuqatihi wa la tamutunna illa wa antum muslimun. You who believe, fear Allah, have taqwa of Allah as He should be feared, and do not die except in a state of Islam. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu taqullaha wa qulu qawlan sadidan yuslih lakum a'malakum wa yaghfir lakum dhunubakum wa ma ya'ti lillahi wa rasulahu faqad fawza fawzan adheeman. You who believe, be aware of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and speak a straightforward word, so that He may forgive you your dunub, He may forgive your bad deeds and repair them. And whomsoever takes Allah and His Prophet as a guide, then he has indeed achieved a mighty victory. And tonight is week 6 of the IslamPolicy.com's Sharia Compliant Finance course with the subtitle Paradigm Shift or Neo-Imperialism. We have addressed so far a basic summary of the Sharia Compliant financial field itself, and have analyzed the reality that we will be utilizing our time here to look at the Sharia compliant finance industry as a dynamic interchange, as a set of organizations, as a set of institutions, is based on a set of principles, but functioning in a very real world. And so the first week emphasized the fact that we were going to look not at the face value of things, but to try to investigate things dynamically as they interchange and interplay with each other, so that we could arrive at an understanding of what the essence of the Sharia compliant industry means. And the reason that we want to do so is because as we formulated this course and held a vote on IslamPolicy.com shortly after our transition from RevolutionMuslim.com, we put about 5 course ideas on the homepage of Islam Policy. One of those titles of the courses, there was 4 different titles if I remember correctly, one of which was the Sharia Compliant Finance Industry Paradigm Shift or Neo-Imperialism, which won out, and the other most prominent and popularly voted for position was entitled Arab Authoritarianism, or something to this effect. That means that at the time that this course was formulated, we still lived under the incessant dictatorships in Egypt and Tunisia. There was very little promise or hope or even prospect and prediction that there would be some form of Arab uprising or Islamic awakening, or however we want to term it, a basic general strike from tyranny in the heart of the Muslim world. That being said, and now we're on the 6th of our bi-weekly courses, it is an imperative identification that we must make that for any society to function and for any civilization to flourish, for any community to survive, then there is an attached ideology which that community must adhere to. There is a system of beliefs, a system of ideas that in turn drives a system of practices, a series of practices that are able to formulate the reality of a society. The Sharia-compliant finance industry we identified is only approximately 35 years old in its modern variety, but the texts on which it is based, allegedly, date back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And last time that we discussed the historical progressions of economic realities in the world generally, and insofar as Islam contributed to contemporary economic ideology, and also, in a sense, posed a form of private property based capitalism that was quite different than what we would call state capitalism or crony capitalism, based predominantly on bailing out of the dominant authoritarian institutions like multinational corporations, financiers, and financial institutions, and always placing the burden of cyclical downturns or of crises in the economic realm, if you will, on the general mass. And today what we're going to discuss is the phenomenon of neo-imperialism, inshallah ta'ala, as it contributes in the end to the reality of the Sharia-compliant financial field. And the reason that we need to do so is because we have identified that there is a tendency inside of the contemporary Sharia-compliant finance industry to merely reproduce the conventional products of interest-based items and interest-based systems that were developed in the West, that were advanced in the West, and that instead of really pose a true economic paradigm that could counterbalance one that is prevalent in the West, what they have conducted and concocted in the $1 trillion Sharia-compliant finance industry is something that can merely contribute and play alongside of a niche industry, if you will, based upon this reality that over the past generation we have seen people return to an interest in the religion of Islam in droves. And so in many ways we are presented with a conundrum and paradox, a paradox of opportunity on one hand and a paradox of adulteration and manipulation on the other hand, where the sacred tenets of Islam are being twisted and turned so that they fit contemporary norms in regard to the realm of manipulation and indoctrination and adulteration. And then on the other hand, that over time we have seen significant developments to the degree that there exists a very real opportunity, especially in the post-2007-2008 crisis arena, where an alternative economic paradigm is not only indeed desired, but in fact may prove to be absolutely crucial in the event that we hit another crisis within the global economy. And the paradox that is presented by the Sharia-compliant finance industry is quite akin to the paradox that is prevalent and insidious inside of this ummah today. That is a conflicting tendency towards preserving what is sacred or twisting what is sacred into something that is accepted in the sake of modernization. And that is a important conception that goes and runs along the lines of what we will talk about today. Today's discussion will be heavily historically laden. And it is important that we talk about that historical progression, because as the course description includes, the definition of the course and the explanation of the course is that during this session we will explain the post-World War II American-led empire and the specifics of its domination. But we're not going to start with the period that America realizes after World War II that it is the world's dominant power, controlling approximately half the world's total cumulative economic activity. Was stated, and we oftentimes refer to the quote from George Kennan, Secretary of State at the time, that something along the lines, to paraphrase, that coming out of World War II, the United States realized that we have 6.5% of the world's population, but 50% of its resources. That being our position in the world, we will not fail but to be the object of envy and resentment. Our goal in the coming terms, and he said especially in Asia, he said our goal in the coming terms must be to preserve this disparity in wealth and put away all false notions of idealism, meaning the idea that you should try to democratize the entire world and you should try to grant some form of distribution of wealth throughout the world that would take away the disparity of the American system, 6.5% of the wealth, 50%, 6.5% of the population and 50% of the wealth. And so what they proceeded to do was design a system coming out of the 1945 Bretton Woods agreements that would preserve American hegemony in the world and allow them, the American system, to take over for its traditional colonial British and French counterparts. And so today we will discuss that, but in context of a greater historical progression that connects the American empire itself to the general tendency within European civilization as it rose from the Dark Ages. And so when we talked about capitalism and the history of Islam, the role of private property in Islam absent a heavy reliance upon riba and the prohibition of riba, we talked about the society of a physical economic society developing. And we left ourselves with the reality that as Europe turned towards the Muslim world and pulled itself away from the utilization of Roman numerals to keep accounting, as it pulled itself away from this notion that it was best to stay poor, indoctrinated notions of Christianity that no man may get through heaven, to heaven except that he might sell all that he owns, and that a rich man cannot get into heaven any easier than a camel can pass through the eye of the needle, and the utilization of the church in Rome to prepare for a feudal society based around these principles. Well, when the Christian Western European civilization turned away from these principles and started to adopt some of what the travelers picked up from the scientific and economic realm from Islam, then they started to give birth to their Renaissance, something the historical records don't normally include, but increasingly so do today in an era of post-Orientalism. So today I will discuss imperialism, or neo-imperialism, and I will give a thorough background, but then, inshallah ta'ala, we will move on to identify the recent revolutions in the Arab world and to identify the role that neo-imperialist policies play within this struggle to wrest the regions of Tunisia and Egypt from the dictatorial powers that we will discover in closer scrutiny are not necessarily the doings of, as portrayed in the West, a backwards authoritarian culture, but are more so the deliberate policies associated with a neo-imperialist parasite and slime mold that actually conducts operations all over the world in every nation today. So we definitely live in difficult times where it's hard to identify any good news at all for the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also has given us signs in His discussing the delivery of the messages, the message by the messengers to their people, and identifying indicators from which we can identify the fundamental phase shift where the call to Allah Azza wa Jal's deen and His religion is entering into a terminal phase for the enemies of Islam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala suggests in Surah Al-Anbiya, the beginning, He describes a principle which we do in fact see unfolding before our very eyes today. Allah Azza wa Jal says in Surah Al-Anbiya, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, بل متعنا هؤلاء وأبهم حتى طل عليهم الأمور فلا يرون عنا ناتي الأرض ننكسها من أطرافها أفهم الغالبون قل إنما أنذركم بالوحي ولا يسمع الصم الدعاء إذ ما ينذرون. Allah Azza wa Jal says, we allow the people, the sinners, and He was addressing the Quraysh who were going against the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said, we allow the sinners, as we allowed their fathers before them, to enjoy the good things of this life, the pleasures of this world, for a great length of time. But then, have you not seen how we reduce the power that they control on the periphery of their domination, that we reduce the power of what they control in the earth, gradually depriving it of all that is best thereon? Can you then hope that you will ultimately in the end be the winners? And then Allah Azza wa Jalla informs His Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the Quran with Qul, say to them, إِنَّمَا أَنذِرْكُمْ بِالْوَحِي, surely I warn, you warn Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam only with the wahi, only with the revelation from Allah, but the deaf, of course, will never hear the call. And so within these this series of ayat in Surah Al-Anbiya, this is ayah 44 and ayah 45, we see that Allah Azza wa Jalla uses a verb nankusuha. We reduce it, we shrink it. And the great alim of our era, Muhammad al-Amin al-Shankiti, described this ayah in his tafsir of Adwa al-Bayan, and he said in relation to the meaning of nankusuha that it is from the root naqs, meaning to shrink or to reduce the periphery of. And he, rahimahullah ta'ala, said that it means to shrink the land in control of the kuffar and dar al-harb. Means that they shrink the land that they control in the periphery so that they wipe away the periphery and send the Muslims to it. And they appear to the people of the land, and the Muslims then begin the initial process of making it Dar al-Salam. And I think that it's very important that we isolate this concept of nankusuha when we look at the principles and the realities that are unfolding in the Middle East, or the region specifically of Egypt, Tunisia, in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, all across the Arab and Muslim world today. This idea that these were once outposts for empires, home of Sykes-Picot, home of British imperialism, and that in fact there is an effort here to shrink the dictates of the present power structure that we see today. And it's quite fascinating, in fact, when you look at the polls and you see this struggle that's about to play out for control over the directions of these societies. Still, the authoritarian elite within these societies are turning to the World Bank and the IMF for assistance and for loans, but the majority polling on the ground shows that there's an overwhelming desire to end the peace accords or the peace process that was conducted with Israel. There is attacks on the oil lines that are running into Israel from Egypt. There's an overwhelming lack of support for the United States of America. You can see people come out as they assassinate and martyr, in fact, Osama bin Laden. And you can see the people come out to the streets, and they're not afraid to say that they consider him a martyr in Islam. And so we do see a fundamental phase shift taking place from amongst the Ummah today. And this indeed is, in fact, whether we realize it or not, the beginning of a birth pang of identifying an imperialist, parasitical leech, if you will, and trying to break away from it. So when Muhammad al-Amin al-Shankiti identifies this principle addressed by Allah Azza wa Jal in the term nankusuha, we must understand that this represents the potential that identifies something that happened to the Quraysh. Remember that the Quraysh were an economic system. The Quraysh, their power and their prestige was based upon their control of the Kaaba, but the fact that the religion had mutated itself into commercial practices, meaning that there was 360 gods apart from Allah Azza wa Jal around the Kaaba, and that people would pay tribute to them, and that the Hajj every year represented the basis by which a trade and a mercantilist form of economic development would give huge opportunities for the Quraysh to attain rich wealth due to their domination, one of ideology from a religious sense, and two, of the control of the mercantilist trade routes and also the marketplaces by making Mecca a hub for trade. And when the Prophet ﷺ made hijrah, this represented not only an ideological threat, for the da'wah now had an opportunity to be proclaimed in its entirety, and then Allah Azza wa Jal started to send down the rules, and He sent down the jihad, and He sent down the fasting, and He completed the deen after 13 years of calling to Tawheed in Mecca and suffering under persecution. But what also happened was that there was some form of economic structure, because the Prophet ﷺ, as soon as the ayat of jihad were revealed, began small ghazawat, small raids that would go out and they would interfere with Qurayshi caravans. And this was something that was a form of naqs. It was a form of shrinking nankusuha, reducing the territory that the Quraysh had control of. And any expansion of any economic power, any nation or any community that develops itself internally and then attains a certain amount of wealth is always going to try to expand by its very nature. And so the threat of hijrah was one that was not just ideological in variety, but it was in fact economic in variety. And I think that anyone that wants to advocate for a Islam as the solution today must then understand the importance of the economic component of any social movement or any social struggle. Today we live amongst the American empire. However, everyone is telling us, like the Quraysh were telling others at the time, that America is not an imperialist entity. It's not about control. It's not about punishment. In fact, it's not in any way, shape, or form a tyrant or oppressor at all. It is a freedom-generating democracy machine. It is a liberator. And this is because of the narratives that have always been woven into empires themselves. It has nothing to do with the American system. It is in fact every single empire's tradition that they not only thought they were never going to fall and denied the fact that they were going to repeat the mistakes of those that came before them before falling into the very mistakes and following the same path, but additionally they held that they were something new altogether. And it's a fascinating component today to watch as the pundits in the press and the majority of information in the world, in fact, is highly defensive and highly promoting this idea that the American system is one of liberation, that Americans do not oppress at all. And that was evident in the past few weeks of rhetoric that we have seen associated with the martyrdom of Sheikh Osama ibn Laden. Charles Meyer, a Harvard historian, in his book Among Empires, The American Ascendancy and Its Predecessors, grapples with this question of whether or not the American system is in fact an imperialist entity like empires that came before it. And he says in the book, quote, "Empires have a voracious appetite for self-celebration, and they reward their talented wordsmiths. An empire, we insist on this, is not just a state that subjugates other peoples or states. It is not just a superstate or a large component of the state system. It is a system of rule that transforms society at home even as it stabilizes inequality transnationally by replicating it geographically in the core and on the periphery. In return, it promises to make even the most materially disadvantaged in the core stakeholders, often enthusiastic ones, in the imperial project. It enlarges territory or decisive influence to ensure its own new political order, and then it must defend the contested boundaries it has extended to avoid discrediting the expansion previously attained." And so in summary of this very prolific statement, which I think requires another read, so let me actually copy it here. Basically what is being said is that empires domestically tend to, if you want to give it a read, it's there. Empires domestically always reward, first and foremost, the people that are going to be proponents of the empire, the people that are going to classify it as a liberator. And that an empire, therefore, becomes something that is not just something that is internal to a superstate or a large territory, but is constantly expanding. And it's transnational, where it stabilizes inequality transnationally by replicating it geographically in the core. And so it makes the most materially disadvantaged in the core stakeholders. And this is a phenomenon that we see miraculously today from amongst the Muslim Ummah, whereas we have these Muslims that are very, in America, they're very high performing in comparison to their American counterparts with regard to education, most of them, many doctors, many lawyers, many scientists, many engineers. But at the same time, we see them incredibly enthusiastic about supporting the American-led empire. And so it's a very prolific statement worth contemplation over, but this is indeed what we face today. And it's something that we have really seen exacerbated since the system, or since the American system itself went into Iraq shortly after the attacks of September the 11th and the entry into the Afghanistan war before that. And right at the time that the Americans went into Iraq, on the eve of the Iraq War, Niall Ferguson, a historian from Oxford, a British historian that is now a resident in Harvard, another basically British institution, released a book in which argued that the British Empire was actually completely successful, that it was not an empire at all, that it protected international law, that it kept these trade routes open, that it spread liberalism across the world. And then, as the Iraq War unfolded, it certainly didn't surprise anyone when Niall Ferguson became a proponent in 2005, 2006 of staying the course in Iraq to prevent civil war and to protect international law, to keep trade routes open and to spread quote-unquote liberalism, arguing that the American empire, like the British one that came before it, was ultimately benign and was going to, if it stayed the course, be able to promote a new liberal ideology in the region. And this is something that continues through from the predecessors to the American empire, which would be the British and French predominantly, but before that in Europe, going all the way back to the Venetian system itself. America is in fact a continuation of European imperialism although it is a continuation of European imperialism that had learned some new things from the mistakes made by its predecessors. Remember, America in itself is a country and a nation that was founded not only in the belief that it should be an empire, as stated by many of the founding fathers, quote unquote, but also founded on the notion of breaking away from an empire before it. And so there is somewhat of a difference between the American system and what came before it. But over time, we also see, and we will see today, that how that system was infiltrated, penetrated, and adulterated so that it became one that never stood a chance to become anything else. We also have to remember that while we promote America as an ultimately liberating force, it is a country that was founded on the genocide of an entire race of people. So while we have documents like the Constitution formulated at the Continental Congress in 1787, we have principles therein that sound highly intelligent and based upon principles that are allegedly universal for man. But we also have the fact and the fundamental reality that the nation was built by 5 million slaves shipped from Africa and by the killing, maiming, and genocide of the Native American population. The similar situation indigenous to America's trek through its own territory from the west, or from the east to the west, is evident in a 78-year period of rise where the Europeans spread into Latin America and Africa. And we know that in 1800, European capital, as the Americans broke away from that system, controlled or occupied 35% of the land surface of the globe in 1800. But by 1878, even though the American system had risen, was busy taking care of genocide on its own territory, European capital and European control of the colonial entities, or the colonialist entities, by 1878 had controlled 67% of the total landmass, and by 1914, on the eve of World War I, the Europeans controlled over 84% of the total landmass of the world. Between 1870 and 1900, about 1/4 of the entire land surface of the world was divided up among the colonial powers of Europe. So we have in the traditional Marxist tradition, remember that there was no such thing as Islamic opposition to empire only about 30 years ago. Everyone, even in the Muslim world, if they were anti-imperialist, they were in fact most likely communist or Marxist. And so the principle of imperialism is a term that arises with the principle of modern capitalism. It's a Marxist theory who, of course, predominantly wrote on this notion of critiquing capitalism, and was continued often to other theorists like Lenin in the USSR, who said that imperialism is actually the highest stage of capitalism. When we think of the term imperialism, we must understand that it is in fact a Marxist term. There is really no equivalent in the Islamic texts of tradition. However, there are indicators when we look at the majority of the Quran being, for example, the story of Musa alayhi, not the majority, but a large portion of the Quran being the story of Musa alayhi salam and his struggle against Pharaoh. We do realize that imperialism is evident. When we look at the story, the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we realize that it was a struggle. We look at the lives of Shuaib, of Yunus alayhi salam, of all of these prophets. We do see that imperialism is actually a fundamental component of systems of kufr and shirk, and that is a fact. However, it is in fact a Marxist term, termed by many, including Marx himself, and it precedes Marx. But it basically means that as a capitalist system based on private property and the accumulation of surplus value concentrates wealth in fewer and fewer hands, and we'll talk about how that happens, the possibility for investment at home is exhausted. So there's no more opportunity to extract profit at home. And so capitalists with extra capital, because of the nature of capitalism itself, always needs to produce a profit and be moving, have no choice but to invest abroad. And so they established colonies. And of course that amassing of wealth with opportunity to invest doesn't necessarily mean that there must be colonization or imperialism as defined by exploitation. does present an opportunity that is quite evident in any society that becomes successful, that there will be this natural capability to expand. And this is something that we believe in Islam allows the Islamic economic model to sit in between Marxism and capitalism and to present something altogether different. Although that is a bit of a different conversation, I don't want to deviate much because we have a lot to cover tonight, but I just want to make that point. Today we have similar conditions that are existent when we talk about imperialism in a globalized capitalist system. The entire world is basically adhering to one particular ideology that some would call capitalism, others would call neoliberalism, some would call imperialism. It depends on how you classify it, but we have markets and we have free markets, and we have the basis of capitalist doctrine allegedly drives. 1 second. Okay, so unlike others, the system that we live on today of globalized capitalist imperialism is not based on race, and so that's a fundamental difference between the American-led empire. It's not one that is based on the Darwinist conceptions of race, although there are still racial tendencies in regard to the way that things play out. But we have different rhetoric associated with the American empire. And we have to understand it is a form of corporate fascism for sure, and we'll get into that. We have to understand a term before we move forward that is called the accumulation of capital. Accumulation of capital is a principle that necessitates that once there is capital accumulation and the solid basis for the fundamental building up of a capitalist society in a nation, in a state, in a community, anywhere it may exist, that there will be ultimately the necessity that it goes overseas for investment. And the accumulation of capital that was part of the readings for this week's session is a book by a woman, a socialist by the name of Rosa Luxemburg, who I think has identified the economic processes of imperialism probably better than anyone before her. And we will talk about that reading in a minute. But she wrote a book called The Accumulation of Capital, a contribution to an economic explanation of imperialism. And we have to understand that basically in this book it was described that once the processes of private property and capitalism are set into motion, then the surplus value and the profit that is created can no longer exploit labor and must turn towards the periphery and develop an ever-expanding periphery. So we use the term accumulation of capital to refer in economics as a net addition, a growth to existing wealth in a system. Or also from a Marxist or imperialist standpoint to talk about the redistribution of wealth. If more wealth is produced inside of any society, then a society generally we would think becomes richer, but we also have to look at where that wealth is distributed to. And this is something that plagues economic analysis unto today. Just because an economy is growing doesn't mean that it's growing for everyone. And oftentimes this is the fundamental flaws that we'll talk about when we talk about Tunisia and Egypt and the World Bank touting them as the greatest economic successes in Africa in the run-up right before the uprisings broke out, never ever taking the time to look at the distribution of wealth within the society. The same is true of the East Asian crisis, which came a decade before, at the end of the 1990s. And so anywhere we look, we see that there's an inability to differentiate between growth and distribution. And so this is one of the critiques that we start with when we look at the quote-unquote accumulation of capital. An accumulation of capital does in fact mean that a overall net addition to existing wealth is occurring inside of a society. But what we do have to also understand is that if there's a redistribution of wealth that extracts the quality of life from the poor and their wealth and transitions it to the rich, who then turn toward investing overseas and toward distributing that wealth elsewhere, and that there's no accrued benefit at home, then there's no accumulation of capital for all. There's an accumulation of capital for the few and at the expense of the many. And that's the overall general principle associated with what we would call an imperialist system, that as the accumulation of capital forces expansion on a periphery, that it in fact contributes to a process of reproducing that process on the periphery, which is to extract wealth from the mass for the hands of a capitalist few. So accumulation of capital is usually dependent, therefore, upon domination, upon some form of slavery, of all varieties of slavery, whether it's wage slavery today, or whether it was the traditional slavery associated with the rape of Africa in the 400-year process that unfolded from Europe, or whether it's the natural resource exploitation. We do have to understand that accumulation of capital must also identify not just growth, but distribution. And where we see uneven distribution, then you will see everything that goes with it, which is essentially the imperialist processes. So where you can identify accumulation of capital, then you investigate distribution of wealth. Where you identify a redistribution of wealth on behalf of the elite, then you have the processes associated with imperialism, whether they occur domestically or whether they occur abroad. And one of the final cracking points for an imperialist project gone bad is that the accrued victories and benefits that may have been accrued by a domestic constituency at home are eventually evaporated as there's problems on the periphery, as addressed in the concept of Nankusuhan. So we see that this is the case actually today. If we look at the crisis that has unfolded from 2007 on forward, yes, indeed, that is the case where banks were bailed out, and we'll define it in 1 minute. We recently had a report from the FCIC in America, the Federal Crisis Investigation Committee, called the Angelides Report, that talked a lot, and I implore anyone that's really interested in economics at an academic level to read the report, because the American Investigating Committee is actually convicting its own financial parasite, domestic to the society, for being the cause of the crises. And then, therefore, they're saying that things need fundamentally changed, but the political system itself has failed to change them or alter them in any significant way. And in fact, the policies that are associated with the reaction, the very rare different monetary policy, quantitative easing, taking the assets that are sour off of banks, not only domestic American banks, but over $25 trillion worth of bailouts to banks that include banks from all over the world, from the Arab world to the rest of society, represent trying to bail out a financial system that has in fact extracted its ability to extract surplus value, and we'll talk a little bit about that so that we understand how those processes unfold and are important. The fact of the matter is that what we are seeing is we're seeing the bailing out of a system that will need bailing out again, because when crony capitalism crashes, it is possible to keep perpetuating it by trying to extract what we call surplus value out of labor, out of other means. But in the end, it ultimately leads to continuing and ongoing more crises. And it's true when we look and we analyze from our own perspective the system of wealth distribution in the Muslim world. When we look at the assets under management in the Sharia-compliant finance industry, the quote-unquote $1 trillion under asset management, we see that this is in no way contributing to a rise in a net addition to existing wealth, other than for a particularly small niche population on top. And so one of the primary indicators that the Sharia-compliant finance industry itself is not, in fact, any way, shape, or form a component of paradigm alteration or paradigm shift with regard to healing the catastrophe that is unfolding before our very eyes as a macroeconomic paradigm in the world. One of the primary ways we can identify that it is, in fact, a component of today's neo-imperialism and an adherent to the same policy and the same doctrine is when we do analyze the accumulation of capital within the industry itself, but then also the distribution of that. And so that's what we see. Interesting report came out. I'll paste this link here. I don't have time to talk about the specifics of it, but basically it shows that now that the home mortgages in America are going, people think that the value of houses is going to stabilize, even though most people think that they, when the Fed pulls away and the federal government pulls away all its propped up manipulation, keeping an asset bubble alive, that prices will fall further. We now have major players in the Sharia compliant. Walaikum salam rahmatullah. We now have major players in the Sharia compliant industry themselves that are going and looking into investing in that housing market, and that's because of what we identified earlier in the course as, I guess it's not evident, as the petrodollar recycling scheme, whereby the money in dollar bills is utilized through the OPEC system, which set up Saudi Arabia as the dominant power and set up Saudi state that guaranteed that all OPEC oil would be sold for dollar bills. But when we look at the traffic flows of those dollar bills, while people starve in Africa and while people work in sweatshops in Southeast Asia, those capital flows make their way back to Wall Street. And this is another way whereby assets, because you have in Sharia compliant finance, you do have to have some sort of tangible asset ownership of investment, and so the housing market in America represents to them, allegedly, a great opportunity to turn a quick buck, but actually it represents a great opportunity for them to claim allegiance to an American empire by purchasing the underlying assets that represent the bad debt that's sour in the system. And they'll probably take loans and losses on it, and perhaps even jeopardize the continuation of the Sharia-compliant finance sector in and of itself. But that is, in fact, a lecture that would be about an hour and a half long by itself as well. So I just want to bring up this notion while we're talking about, the processes of accumulation of capital as they relate to imperialism, and how you have to identify accumulation of capital and concentrate on redistribution of wealth. I'd like you to watch this video if you can hear it. So tell me if the sound is good as I play this.
Cliff, there was an article on the BBC website yesterday saying that the German publisher of Marx's Das Kapital has sold this year to date 10 times more copies than they did last year. I thought Marx was a dead theorist and totally discredited. Tell me, why are people interested?
I think they're interested, Mark, because he has a particular take on capitalism. People get confused about what Marx was about. They think he wrote about communism. Was that only a tiny amount of what he wrote was about a future communist society? 95% or more of what he wrote was about capitalism. So it's his analysis of capitalism that people are interested in because of the problems that we're facing at the moment, and that's why it's pertinent. And if you like, I can take you through his theory of crisis, which is the kind of central bit that's pertinent to what we're
Yeah, that'd be fantastic if you could, yeah.
Well, if you stand over there, and I'll tell you all about it, right? It starts with the labour theory of value, okay, which was not something that Marx invented. This is from Ricardo and Smith, classical economists of the 18th and 19th century. But basically, the labour theory of value says that only people make and create value, right? Machines or flip charts have value, they have use value, okay, they are useful things, but the flip chart on its own can't do anything, okay, it can't create more value than it has. The only thing that can create more value out of the flip chart is if somebody does something with it, somebody does something with it. So that's the basic idea of the labour theory of value. Now, what I'm going to take you through is a very rapid distillation of a pile of books this high, okay? So the pure Marxist scholars that might happen upon this will probably be appalled at the way I'm simplifying things, but in order to get the essence of the arguments over, I'll do the best I can. If we assume this is the working day, okay, it can be divided up into two component parts, right? Now, this is the average working day, so if you look at it across the global economy, that'll be times, I don't know, 3 billion, or however many people are working, okay. Now, this part here we call the variable capital. This is if we start at 9 o'clock. By about 2 o'clock, okay, I have created enough value to pay for my wages, okay? All the time that I then work for the rest of the afternoon is creating what Marx calls surplus value, right? Now, surplus value is the source of profit, okay? And clearly, if this line can move, depending on various changes in the economy, which I'll briefly explain in a moment. Now, the ratio of these two, S over V, Marx calls the rate of surplus value, and we'll see how this is crucial in a moment. Okay, that's the first thing. Now, the rate of profit, which is the crucial measure here, is surplus value over variable capital, which is the amount that's funding the wages here, okay, and this thing here called C, which Marx calls constant capital. Now, this is machinery, it's bought-in material, okay, it's leather, it's whatever it is we're working with, okay, paper, all right? The reason he calls it constant capital is its value does not change, okay? It is what it is, which comes back to this basic idea of the labour theory of value. Now, his theory of crisis is based on what he calls the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall over a business cycle, right? Now, why it falls is actually the nub of the argument, okay? He says due to competition in markets, the capitalist, the owner of the business, can't fritter away all this surplus value in luxury expenditure, right? A significant proportion of this has to be reinvested to protect himself from competition and to gain a march on competitors. Now, because of technical improvements in the way we make things, okay, the productivity of labour has improved dramatically over the years through the introduction of machinery. Now, machinery is this bit here, all right, the constant capital. Now, over time, as the businessman invests, the ratio of constant to variable capital increases. There's more machinery working with the individual labourer, okay? And then you can see this manifested in process industries, for example, where you just see a mass of pipe work and about two blokes with a hard hat in the corner. I mean, that would be an extreme case. But the general tendency is still there to replace living labour, which is the V bit, with what he calls dead labour, which is the constant capital. So, over time, through this process of accumulation, which is not an option for a capitalist, he has to do this, okay? This ratio, C over V, which he calls the organic composition of capital, not a particularly helpful term, but that ratio increases over time. Now, here's the trick. If we now divide through this equation here by V, okay, we then get S over V divided by C over V plus 1. Okay, now, if this increases, as we've just explained, over a business cycle, and this ratio, the ratio of surplus value, or the rate of surplus value, if that increases at a lower speed than this, then overall this equation, which is the rate of profit, okay, that goes down. Right. Now, he calls it the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. There are counteracting influences which can delay the onset of this effect. One of them is if you have improvements in productivity in wage goods producing industries, the amount of value that's needed to pay wages, if you like, or to feed the workers, etc., can reduce. So that line can go that way, so surplus value can increase. You can increase this by speeding up production lines, so the individual hour of the worker's time produces more stuff. You can, in fact, extend the working day, as France has done recently. They tried to reduce it, they've had to extend it, because they're not competitive with the reduced working day. And foreign trade and globalization, as other things that Marx suggested, can reduce the tendency of this to fall. But, and what's happened in the current situation, in my view, is that we've delayed the onset of this, because these are all value terms based on labour time. These are not money terms, okay? And if you've expanded credit, which they have done over the past 8-10 years, then you can delay the monetary expression of the falling rate of profit. But the underlying, and this is Marx's method, okay, the underlying structure of the economy is reflected here, not in the money appearance of the economy. And eventually, it all falls down, and that's the situation that we're in, because people realise that the rate of profit has fallen. Okay, has fallen, right. How do we get out of the problem, which is the final bit, guys? So, is this. The crisis causes businesses to go bust, okay? There's also consolidations within industries where firms combine together. Sometimes in some process industries there's mothballing of plants, right? Now what that does is it takes C out of the system. Constant capital is then taken out of the system. So this reduces. As businesses go bust, the reserve army of unemployed, as Marx called it, increases. That places downward pressure on wages, okay? Because people are competing for jobs, they'll take a job at a lower pay, etc. And what that does is it reduces V, okay? So if we've reduced that and we've reduced that, then overall that equation gets restored, the rate of profit recovers, and then we're back on another cycle of accumulation, which might last 10 years, 15 years, who knows? You can't predict with any degree of certainty here. But that's the basic theory, okay? And that's maybe why people are looking to buy Das Kapital. Okay,
Cliff, thanks very much indeed. That's been a very quick run-through of some of Marx's key ideas, but that will give me lots to think about over the rest of this week and beyond. So thanks very much indeed.
Okay, Mark, you're welcome.
Okay, so let me try to summarize that. I apologize if you couldn't really hear it. Basically, he started, this is a professor from Britain, I think it was the Cranford School of Management, but I'm not sure. And he addressed the gentleman hosting the television show by saying that after the crisis of 2007-2008, what happened was that there was a 10,000 print run of Das Kapital, the major prolific work by Karl Marx on the critique of capitalism, and that there was so many books being sold that they were astounded by this reality. And that is because he said that much of what was going on as a cause of the crisis was in fact a process associated with some of the core identities that Marx discussed in his theories. And he said that Marx's theory of crises is connected to what's called the labor theory of value. The labor theory of value holds that only people can make things. So people are a necessary component of production, and people have to use it. So people have to purchase it and have to have a need for what is produced. So economies are essentially about people. And in the capitalist economy, that there is then a breakdown with regard to labor of variable and surplus value. So he put a big bar chart and he drew a line and he drew V and S, and he said that this is variable capital, and that variable capital represents is what it takes for the workers to work long enough so that they produce enough product that can pay for the cost of their labor, and that the rest is surplus value, which is profit that is accrued by the capitalist class, the owners of the factories, the owner of the business. So variable surplus, variable costs over surplus value is equal to profit, or surplus value over what they call constant capital, the cost of the plant, the cost of all constant costs, surplus value over constant capital plus variable labor costs, so constant capital costs plus variable labor costs equals profit. So then Marx would take S over C plus V equal to profit, and he would say that the law of the tendency is that rates of profits to fall causes crises. So Marx says that competition forces surplus value to be invested to compete. So the surplus value, all the profit that's extracted from labor, must be invested to continue to create profit. And over time, the ratio of constant cost to variable capital increases due to increased productivity and replacement of the living worker with capital, like machines and technology. So the cost associated with C increases relative to V. I'm sorry, I don't know how to draw. I'd put a formula on the board. And so this ratio increases over time, C over V. So we get surplus value divided by, this is very hard to do without a chalkboard, surplus value divided by variable value divided by constant capital divided by variable capital plus 1 is the rate of profit. And then Marx says this ratio, the rate of profit, decreases as surplus value over V decreases. So as there is a decrease in the surplus value that is due to the exploitation of labor, and today due to globalization and other exploitative mechanisms, then what happens is there's a massive expansion of credit. Repeat what? Okay, back it up. Okay, alhamdulillah. Tendency, okay, yes, this is important actually, you're right, it's the most important part. Okay, there's a tendency, okay, so you have variable capital, you have constant capital, and then you have surplus value, which is essentially akin to the profit. Surplus value has to account for costs. Total value is everything that the factory owner, let's say to keep it simple, makes. Variable costs are the cost of labor, and you have variable costs up to the point where labor is producing what it costs you to employ them to produce it. Everything else that you sell thereafter, so if it takes them 6 hours of their shift to cover variable costs, then you get 2 hours of their production that will be a surplus value for capitalist owner. But he also has to pay constant costs. And because of technology and innovation, machines and other developments, capital costs continue to increase, right? Because labor is constantly being pushed out. So this ratio of constant capital to variable capital increases over time. And so we get a factor which Marx called the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. So the lack of a domestic situation to exploit and extract profit due to variable manipulation, right? Due to manipulating the variable costs and to increasing surplus value means that as the rate of profit falls, then rather than exploit labor to extract additional surplus value, there must be either the expansion of the process to invest and create new markets away from the domestic reality, or there has to be an expansion of credit inside of that society that is meant to delay this cut in profit. Is the sound good or not? I'm sorry. Crises. Sound is good or not? I apologize, Akhi. I don't know what's wrong. Okay, alhamdulillah. So crises, economic crises, then they cause businesses to start to go bust, and then the expansion of credit starts to deleverage or starts to deflate. And what we have then, in order to climb out of a crisis, is that there must be a consolidation of industry that takes the constant capital variable out of the system, and the reserve army of unemployed, as Marx called it, increases. And because there's high unemployment, then you try to stimulate the economy, people go back to the labor market, but they take work at lower wages, which reduces V again. So it reduces V to create more S, surplus, reduces variable cost to create more surplus value, and then we start another cycle of accumulation. But what we're saying is, and this is highly theoretical but important to understand, and we have to understand that we cannot refute the adoption of such a theory because we don't have any Islamic contribution in the realm of economics for at least a few hundred years. So where Marx is correct, he's correct, and this is an absolutely crucial, fundamental identification of the general processes by which crises occur inside of a capitalist economy and why they occur. And what we have to see is that eventually this notion is that there will be a burning out completely. So Marx believed that finance capitalism would actually expand all across the world and then crash to the point where communism was the ultimate victor due to no other alternative. And that was not his only theory. Remember, he basically critiqued capitalism. He didn't have much to say about communism in and of itself. But so we have a process whereby today we're experiencing the same thing. Now we have high unemployment across the world due to a recession. Rather than readjust and make banks take losses, we've expanded credit to create what they would call stimulus, which is taking those unemployed and keeping them unemployed. But now as the stimulus is starting to create economic activity, we have unemployed going back to the marketplace for reduced wages. Reduced wages when you consider inflation and when you consider all economic variables involved, the American worker is now being decimated to similar wages as to his counterpart in China, the Middle East, and across the world. And so this process is becoming one of the global reproduction that is rebuilding a cycle of accumulation, but we have now had the expansion of the capitalist system across the entire world, so one wonders how much longer this can continue to go on. But that is the process that we do see occurring today. And Now I'd like to get into an analysis. I think tonight's discussion is going to be pretty long because I'm already an hour in and I haven't covered much, but I'll try to go about it quickly. I'd like to discuss the concept of accumulation of capital as defined by Rosa Luxemburg. Rosa Luxemburg is absolutely essential reading in her book on accumulation of capital, chapters 27 to 31. It's in the reading pack for this course. But she identifies the process of foreign loans as the means by which empires retain control. Quantitative E. Not necessarily. You have to. We'll talk. Come in the question and answer session. We get through the discussion. Accumulation of capital is built on the principle that you have to look at this capital accumulation and how it then looks for expanding markets abroad, and how the process of European capitalism functions from a standpoint of a usurious or an interest-bearing mechanism. And the interesting thing about Rosa Luxemburg is that she is writing before the World Bank, before the IMF. She's describing British and French imperialism. And you will see that she's actually almost speaking, if you identify and understand the process, she is describing exactly how the World Bank and the IMF, as the transnational institutions that represent the American empire, go about conducting a imperialist operation across the globe today through the neoliberal policies, structural adjustment policies that we'll talk about later. So she starts by addressing in chapter 27, 28, 29, 30, I think 27 through 31, she starts by addressing the process of the accumulation of capital, calling it a three-stage struggle, whereby there is, so you have this process where a power, like America, accumulates capital at home. So we have the American system that wakes up after World War II and it figures out that it has 50% of the world's resources and it needs to expand abroad. And remember, she's writing before the American system existed, and before that it was the British and the French, and before them others. But she says that there's a three-stage process. Firstly, there's a struggle against the natural economy, that where they expand to, they have to change the economy into one that's conducive to capitalism, one that adopts private ownership, one that adopts wage slavery. And then there has to be a struggle of capital against the natural economy. So capital must enforce its norms upon the natural economy, uprooting tradition essentially. Then in the second stage of this process that she terms imperialism, there's a struggle against the commodity economy. So you have to take a commodity economy and you have to transfer it into one that's based upon norms like paper fiat currency and wage labor and different systems, uproot the commodity economy. And then in the third stage, the competitive struggle of capital on the international stage for the remaining conditions of accumulation. So once there's the synthesis of a particular economy into the capitalist system, then there must be expansion into other territories because everything has been extracted and the system is in place, and so by its very nature it must continue to grow, this being a natural, inherent part of the capitalist system in and of itself. And she says, quote, that the existence and development of capitalism requires an environment of non-capitalist forms of production. But not every one of these forms will serve its end. So against natural societies, Rosa Luxemburg says, capital must, one, gain control of land, minerals, metal, and natural resources. Secondly, must liberate labor power and coerce it to service. And thirdly, must introduce the commodity economy. And fourthly, must separate trade and agriculture. I want you to remember those four principles because we'll talk about the dictated policy of the World Bank in about 20 minutes, and that would be very important to understand. Basically, you have to gain control over everything that is of wealth, mostly the minerals, the metals, and the natural resources. You have to take people and make them believe that they have to work on behalf of this newly imposed economic order. And then you have to introduce a commodity economy, and then you have to separate trade from agriculture so that there can be no form of traditional tie between the two, and you're basically uprooting any potential for sovereignty. She says that first, in colonial territories, capital must plan for the systemic destruction and annihilation of all non-capitalist social units. And she describes Britain in India, and France in Algeria. It's a must-read. I swear, it's the best. It's the best analysis of imperialism you will ever read. I don't read Marx much. It's dense. I can barely understand what the heck he's talking about most of the time. I read Das Kapital maybe 10 years ago, most of it, volume 1 at least, and basically what she describes in her chapter 27 is this process of expansion of the British into India. And she actually addresses the history of Islam, stating that it's fundamentally different. There's a great quote in the book where Rosa Luxemburg says, quote, "None of the Mohammedan conquerors had ultimately violated the internal social life of the peasant masses." So Rosa Luxemburg is probably one of the only objective Marxists that ever looked at the history of Islamic expansion, that ever identified that it was fundamentally different, and identified properly that the fundamental difference between what we call Islamic expansion or opening is that it does not mess or violate the internal social structures of the people that are already living there. It does impose the Shariah, of course, but it allows people to remain living in their traditional organizations. And this is something that we must identify that hasn't been elaborated on anywhere else. It's not part, you can't read a book about it, but it's something that if someone wants to pursue a master's degree or a PhD should certainly write about, the fundamental distinction between the expansion of capital under European system and the expansion of capital under the consolidation and control of Mecca, and then the flourishing of the Islamic civilization in the 100 years thereafter and the 1400 years of its successful history. She says that Muslims, Arabs, Afghans, and Mongols included, and maintained canals and roads, that when they went to territories and they implemented the Sharia, that they actually kept the infrastructure to develop it, because they did not want to starve the people and create dependencies. They just wanted the economy to rule so that they could tax. The benefit was in the kharaj, the benefit was in the zakat, the jizya, and they didn't uproot anything that would be of benefit. And she contrasts that with the East India Company, which is the form of the very first multinational corporation, which she says, quote, did not make any spring accessible. So they completely dominated control and access to the waters, and they became a toll economy. Basically, you have to pay a toll to get to the water, so you're basically able to extract taxes from the peasants, otherwise they die. She then goes on to address the French in Algeria and how they destroyed Arab family associations, how they lied and they told the people that in Islam, because all land belongs to the ruler, which of course is not true. There's private property in Islam, that because they had conquered the ruler, that now all the property belonged to them. The British did the same in North Africa. But basically, the concept was that the Muslims already had this concept of women. Just an aside, Noah Feldman in his book on the rise and fall of the Islamic State states very clearly that one of the beautiful things about the Islamic system was that it gave private property rights to women 1,200 years before Europe did, and that when Europe spread into Algeria, one of the very awkward things that they did was they had no concept of private property for women, so any woman that owned land automatically had its land revoked and given to the colonizers. So they use that as an excuse. They also use this excuse that because the ruler is everything, the sultan is everything in the Islamic system, and they conquered the sultan, that basically that meant that all of the land was theirs. And so they built, very much like Israeli settlements today, what they called cantonments of French settlers, and they were established. And after that, the French suggested that Arabs desired private land, and so they did away with the family system. So after they uprooted everything that was existent there before, the communal sort of relationships that existed by the Arabs that were living in Algeria with regard to their communities, with regard to their families, and they sort of took everything for themselves, then they reinstituted the concept of private property once it was all theirs. She says, of recent years, this mutilation of Algeria, which had been going on for 80 years, or 8 decades, meets with even less opposition, since the Arabs, surrounded as they were by French capital following the subjection of Tunisia and the recent conquest of Morocco, have been rendered more and more helpless. The latest result of the French regime in Algeria is an Arab exodus into Turkey. So perhaps Rosa Luxemburg could be considered the first empathizer with the Islamist cause. But she ends, and she's basically describing how the traditional economies are uprooted as the accumulation of capital occurs and it expands into new territory as an imperialist entity. Introduction, she says, then, is the next phase is the introduction of the commodity economy. And she says, as soon as independence is breached, as soon as you control the political systems of this land, then what they do, what the imperialists do, is they construct immediately railways, telegraph, and infrastructure. So they put the people in a debt by developing infrastructure so that there's this illusion of prosperity, that they're coming to modernize the land. But all of the infrastructure development is typically for resource extraction. And basically this is exactly what we see in Afghanistan. Oftentimes you'll hear liberals talk about how we're building the country up, we're creating systems for democracy, and if you look at all of the roads that have been built, all of the engineering that has been done, it just happily, conveniently lies on the route that will one day be at least an oil pipeline, run minerals out of the society. It's completely strategic for the event that there's a victory there. The infrastructure is destined to extract the resources of Afghanistan so that they can make their way into China, make their way into Pakistan, and down into India so that they can be put on boats and transported across the world. It's phenomenal the way that this process continues today. And of course, no one really identifies it, but it's very important to understand. So after you change the traditional system, you take away the Islam, for example, in Algeria and Tunisia and Morocco, then you introduce the commodity economy. And you introduce the commodity economy by compelling the conquered to buy your development. And you start to build the construction of rail, for telegraph it was for her, and infrastructure under the illusion that you're bringing modernization. Modernization and terminologies of modernization have accompanied all empires, and that's what we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we see today being touted as the Telegraph publishes a report calling for a Marshall Plan for the Middle East. So she gives the great examples that you should read about, very important, relevant to our discussion, of the British East India Company in India, and then them forcing China to purchase their opium. So the Chinese government wanted to ban and outlaw opium that was manufactured in India, but the British did not allow it, and they actually went to war over it in what is called the Opium Wars. And Rosa Luxemburg identifies that as enforcing the commodity economy. So the next stage, and identified in chapter 29 of Rosa Luxemburg's book, Accumulation of Capital, is the struggle against the peasant economy. She says capital needs peasants to buy its products, and so first you start by restricting peasants to a single sphere, that of agriculture. So you put, she uses the example of the development of the transcontinental railway in America, which is dependent upon the killing and subjugation of the native population to agriculture, and also, she says, subjugating them with, quote, firearms, bloodhounds, liquor, and venereal disease, which is in fact an accurate assessment of the history. She's really a genius. It's fundamentally important that anyone that wants to oppose imperialism understand her text. She says that these farmers in America are qualitatively different than those of a generation before them who had skills of manufacture and were independent. So the only thing they know how to do is farm, so you create dependencies. Just like you don't allow in today, the Middle East, think about it, there's no skilled labor. You have engineers working in telecommunications departments, the engineering programs inside of university institutions in the Arab world especially don't give a person the mathematical skills to actually be a functioning engineer. There's no ability to actually have a skill base whereby you could form any form of sovereignty. And after a few generations, you can imagine that it creates dependencies that are very hard to break away from. So she talks a lot about this, and she says that the first aim of capitalism is to isolate the producer, to sever the ties which protect him, and the next task is to take the means of production away from the small manufacturer. Just create dependencies, wage labor and slave wages, essentially. Used to be slavery, today it's done a little bit differently. Big business is certainly the only one that profits from the monopolization of land, and then they bring in the machines and they industrialize, but they do so in a strategic manner that creates a system of elitist control. But then in chapter 30, she describes the most important component. And also, I'm glad you typed that. You have to make them consume. You have to make them work for wages and then give them a wage that allows them to purchase the products so that you can create a system of slavery. In chapter 30, she identifies the imperialist phase of capitalist accumulation. So after these systems are set up, after the people are humiliated and dependencies are created, then there has to be a period of imperialism where there's expansion. And she says that the characteristics of this stage include lending abroad, lending to foreign powers, railroad constructions, and revolutions and wars. Natural economy is transitioned to a commodity economy by war, she believes. I think I disagree with her in that, but that's a different conversation. And then she says the public loans for railway development and armaments accompany all stages of the accumulation of capital. She's talking about railways. We could talk about anything today. Two factors. Public loans for railway development, which of course, public loans to sovereigns that are imperialist entities, that are built by companies coming from the home of the accumulation of capital, and then also dependency by the purchase of armaments. So the armaments industry, look at America today, there's two things it exports, movies and weapons. And the armaments are purchased by predominantly, one of the major purchasers of American weaponry is of course the Arab dictators that are have been controlling, and the weapons that have been used against the people that are in these uprisings have traditionally and for the most part been, no matter where they were, whether Libya, Egypt, or Tunisia, were American arms. And she says that these public loans accompany all stages of the accumulation of capital, but that, quote, through foreign loans, though foreign loans are indispensable for the emancipation of the rising capitalist state, they are the surest ties by which the old capitalist states maintain their influence, exercise financial control, and exert pressure on the customers, foreign and commercial policy of the young capitalist states. So basically she's saying that even though there is an entity that has been indoctrinated into the capitalist model, the traditional power system basically retains control because they're the ones that own the loans. And it's through those loans that they keep control. And she goes on to describe the process as it works. She says that the loans that are given by the traditional imperialist state to the newly liberated nations have various functions. They convert the money of non-capitalist groups into capital. They transform money capital into productive capital by means of state enterprises, meaning they transform money that's accumulated into capital that can be purchased and supportive of the imperialist entity by the building of railroads and military supplies. And then the loans serve to divert accumulated capital from old capitalist countries to new ones. And she gives the example of 16th and 17th century Italy, Britain, Holland, the old Amsterdam entity, 19th century Britain to its subjugation in South America and Australia, from France, Germany, and Belgium to Russia. And then she gives a present example of Germany in 1912 to Turkey, from England, Germany, and France to China, and through Russia to Persia. So it's an assault on the functioning of European capitalism. And she only includes, as the traditional capitalist countries, the European entities. And so we do have to understand this process of imperialism as a European civilizational experience. And that's just a fact. We talked last week about how it developed. This notion of loans, this notion of usury was a part of the development of what was known as the Venetian system, and spread through the Italian system and then into these other empires that Rosa Luxemburg identifies. So it's essential that we understand that capitalists then have no nation if they're always needing to take surplus value and put it abroad and to find new markets and to uproot tradition and to get people engaged in usurious loans. Then they have no nation. And so that the system of capitalism is essentially, whether it says or claims to or not, akin to a negation of the nation state in and of itself. And that's what we really see occurring today. Events which precede a crisis always include the flooding of money and goods and expansion. So there's always, before a burst, this massive capital buildup of speculation. This is what we see happen from the East Asian crises all the way into the modern crises that created expansion in Tunisia and Egypt and ultimately revolution. It's the same method that kept loans coming as bankruptcy reared in. So the idea is that you should see that as risk accumulates, a lack of investment capital coming. But the fact of the matter is that the herd-like behavior of usurious loans creates the conditions by which they continue to issue loans, the traditional powers, because they actually want to see this bubble blow and blow and blow and blow and blow until it bursts. And she gives a very good example in her book to read about the specifics of Turkey, Egypt, Greece, Bolivia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Honduras, Mexico, Paraguay, Peru, Santo Domingo, Uruguay, Venezuela. She says are all defaulted just in the 1870s due to this process. She goes through a good description of it. However, even though that they were about to default, loans to these states continued. And she says that the reason is that they realized that surplus value, which was idle in England or Germany, so due to exploitation of labor in England and Germany, as discussed with regard to Marx, it was invested in railroad construction or public works from the old capitalist countries. So they supplied the materials and know-how, just like today the World Bank works, and the capital loan to sovereign pays for them. So they loan the money to the sovereign, who then takes the money and gives it to corporations and to other systems, whether it be services to develop or what it might be. And it doesn't matter if the capital is lost, because the important thing is that the process of accumulation and the uprooting of old systems must continue. So it's not even about turning a profit, it's just about expanding the order. The accumulation of capital, by its very nature, must expand on ideology and uproot old systems. And the last system that is left with any semblance of an opportunity to... No, that's not true, because Latin America has made a lot of movements in a different direction. But one of the last systems is the old traditional Islamic territory. So we'll say that. And the exploitation of labor is certainly a key component of this process, but we're more concerned about today is this expansion of capital to create not so much profit, because when there's collapse, what they do is they get the sovereign to bail them out. And then the sovereign on the periphery that they're expanding their periphery. The sovereign on the periphery is responsible for paying back the debt so that he can honor his ability to serve as a client of the old colonialist entities, and he has to extract a resource from the population itself to exploit the labor so that he can extract enough surplus value, quote unquote, to pay back the debt. And so the process of accumulation leads to massive exploitation anywhere it goes. And I think it's just it really is hard to explain in summary, but people should really check out the reading itself. And then she goes on to give the great example of Egypt in the second half of the 19th century, from 1845 until 1876, with the bankruptcy of the Egyptian state, something that we always say is more important to identify as the fall of the Khilafah, quote unquote, than is 1924 as a date. She says that in Egypt there was the typical processes we've talked about: the insertion of large-scale capitalist enterprise, the rapid growing public debt, and then the collapse of the peasant economy. So in Egypt, from 1845 to 1853, the sovereign there builds the Suez Canal, irrigation systems, cultivation of cotton, and production of sugarcane. Egypt borrows $3.5 million and pledges 20,000 serfs to the construction for the Suez Canal. So they formulate the Suez Canal Company. It's basically an Egyptian company controlled completely by the British. They borrow £3.5 million, and they pledge 20,000 serfs, cheap labor, to its construction, touted as a national endeavor to expand and modernize the economy, just like we see today. And then this loan, 20 years later, would lead to her bankruptcy and occupation. So 20 years down the road, in 1876, this would lead to the ultimate occupation and colonization of Egypt itself. Now, the we're not going to talk about the specifics because I've rambled on enough, but I do want to mention this fundamental distinction. Egypt in 1850 looks like it is going to develop even better than the United States of America. Remember, America split away in 1776, it had its constitution ratified in 1787, and about 1830 it developed its own process of capital accumulation, and it split away from the British, but was always constantly undergoing the intervention of British finance. Just like Egypt was trying to be conquered through this process of accumulation of capital, even after the Americans won the American Revolution, the British still continued to try to reestablish it as a colony. And one of the ways that they did that was that they created the Civil War as a way to divide and conquer the now non-colonialist entity. And had the Civil War not been won by the North, then America would not exist today as an entity of the United States of America. It would be two separate entities. And the entity that would have won would have been largely due to the fact of the financiers. So as 1850 unfolds, Egypt experienced a massive boom because the price of cotton went up severely because the production of cotton was limited in the South. And Britain loaned Egypt money on the condition that they would transform the entire economy into a cotton-producing economy. And what it did was it created a huge cotton bubble in the world. It was almost like a speculative craze, just like the subprime mortgage bubble. And all the machinery to cultivate the cotton came from Britain. And as the Civil War ended, the bubble burst. So once the North won the war, the bubble burst and it completely decimated the Egyptian economy and led to their bankruptcy. So Britain forced upon the Egyptian economy to grow sugarcane, something that they needed, and British banks gave the loans. But the slaves, they couldn't adapt to the changes in the production of sugarcane, and basically they suffered under horrendous conditions, so that the usurious loans could be paid back by the Khedive in Egypt. So then what happened was, as the bubble of sugarcane and cotton burst in Egypt and the whole economy was basically bankrupt, all of a sudden in 1876, Egypt is not occupied, but they send Lord Cromer, who is from the Barings banking house, and he becomes the financial administrator basically of a economic colonization, with the official bankruptcy of Egypt in 1876, and the Ottomans went bankrupt due to the same processes in the same year. And immediately what they did was they imposed austerity, just like you see happening through the hands of the IMF today in Greece, in Ireland, soon to be in Spain, eventually to be in America after they get done in Europe, all over the place. This is a continuation, but now, as we say, the chicken has indeed come home to roost on some of the old colonialist territories, creeping closer and closer to Europe in order to keep the system alive, to extract additional surplus value. It has now come home to eat at the variable costs of the home shores, and especially in America when we see distribution of wealth and when we look at wages, real wages over time. So in 1882, Egypt gets occupied, and so this is the actual process. We saw the first to conquest in the imperialist model, then accumulation of capital must formulate. It has to gain control over land, minerals, metal, and natural resources, has to liberate labor power and coerce it to service, has to introduce the commodity economy, separate trade and agriculture, and then in debt due to public works projects, etc., it has to extract usurious debt to eventually create a default, to impact austerity measures that can pay back the debt, and then indeed you wipe away the debt in sacrifice for control over making economic law and control over the economy. And that is how traditional imperialism was described by Rosa Luxemburg. So the Egyptian situation was one where they experienced it, coming out of their 1876 bankruptcy and the occupation at Lord Cromer's hands in 1882. Egypt was officially occupied and continued on until the revolution of Nasser, which was funded by the CIA in order to get rid of King Farouk, who was a puppet maintaining a British domination over the nation. The Egyptian economy has not developed in any way, shape, or form of effectiveness since 1882. And now to make a very interesting discussion, and from a reading that is in the course pack from a book called Wall Street, A History, from its beginnings to the fall of Enron, I'll analyze a little bit about why America was different. America in 1850, we said, was very similar to the Egyptian situation, and could have in fact developed just as well. Egypt could have in fact developed just as much as the American system had. But because of a different history, and we'll see why, America went on to become the dominant power in the world. So America split again in 1776, 1787 from the British Empire, and was able to develop itself because it followed a practice that did not adopt principles of free trade. The British were forever trying to reinsert themselves financially into the dictate and to be able to control the American experiment, but they were well aware of the imperialist processes, and so they were able to counter them, and they stayed relatively stable through time. In the 1830s, what you had was this massive development of Wall Street. Wall Street was very much a fledgling system up until about 1830, and we know that Wall Street was largely responsible for formulating the Civil War, and I'll explain a little bit about that, although it requires a conversation in and of itself. Around the 1830s, private banking in the United States attracted foreign firms that wanted to do business in the United States. Because the economy was developing, it looked like it was going to be a stable environment. And in the late 1830s, the famous Nathaniel Rothschild of London established an American firm in America. But because the Americans, contradictory to the people in Egypt who were largely unaware of the Barings Bank that was going to go on to control them, were aware of the system and were educated by the quote-unquote founding fathers of the American Revolution about the nature of British imperialism. It was very hard for institutions and people like the Rothschilds to operate inside the American system. And so what the Rothschilds did was they sent a person they called August Belmont, who established a company called August Belmont and Co., and he was actually, we know from the historical records, a representative of the Rothschilds family in North America. The Rothschilds certainly had investments in the United States, but the economic problems, or what we would call the abolishment of the First National Bank, dissuaded the Rothschilds from investing. They were basically trying to punish, because they were the private capitalists that were able to keep the entire system afloat for quite some time, and by controlling the bond market and by influencing Europe, they were able, by investing in a country, to make it grow, and by pulling investment away from a country to make it falter. But in the 1830s, they decided to go back through a proxy and do some form of investment in the American economy, essentially to try to take it over again, which is what it came about. Well, August Belmont was not August Belmont. His original name was August Schonberg. He was a 20-year-old employee who had worked at the Rothschild Bank in Italy, and was responsible, before he moved to America, to become the representative of advising the Vatican, one of the world's biggest multinational corporations, on its financial affairs. As soon as he came to the United States, he began to rival the other big player on Wall Street that was of European descent. Miraculously, that other big player on Wall Street was the Barings banking house, who Evelyn Cromer or Lord Cromer would go on to control Egypt. And in Wall Street, this new institution, August Belmont and Co., within a few years, went on to become the major creditor of the U.S. government itself, mostly because Belmont was able to have unlimited control and access to wealth through his Rothschilds bankers, and of course most of the people in the West were very suspicious of the fact that he may be an agent, because the Battle of Waterloo, that we all know, was the time when the Rothschilds really made a coup against the British and developed the Bank of England as the model by which they would spread private central banking across the world, these events had recently occurred. Another very important firm that was developed during this run-up to the Civil War was the Junius Spencer Morgan Company, or John Pierpont Morgan, who went on to become the J.P. Morgan House. He was certainly a banker that was quite prominent and developed, and of course we know J.P. Morgan stays prominent today, but of course J.P. Morgan is not an American firm, it's a British firm. So we could identify Wall Street as a British operation. Goldman Sachs was founded in 1869 by Marcus Goldman, a Bavarian Jew, and the majority of the founding, with Kuhn and Loeb, another Jewish organization, Jacob Schiff, many Jewish bankers from traditional European society went and built their financial fortunes upon the back of much attempts at colonialism. Well, as they accumulated wealth, they began to get more influence, and they started to engage in the processes associated with the accumulation of capital as identified by Rosa and Luxemburg. They started to try to invest and to create dependencies. Remember August Belmont of Rothschild's firm, real name Schonberg, actually became the biggest firm loaner to the United States government in the bond market. And so the U.S. government became dependent upon their ability to borrow from Wall Street. And so then comes all of a sudden this manipulation of the Civil War, and they create a civil war in the North and the South based upon the notion that the South wants to secede to preserve its slavery, and it was heavily induced by British advisors, not British, but financial advisors, to create this division, to create this war. And all of a sudden, as Abraham Lincoln is the president of America, he says a very famous statement, "I feel like I have two enemies," or something to this effect. He says, "I'm on the South, I'm fighting the Confederacy. But here in the North, I have a major problem because I'm fighting the bankers, the financial crooks, the criminals." And he doesn't know what to do because the bankers are trying to charge him like 25% interest on any bonds because, again, the Schonbergs, the Rothschilds, or the Belmont, whatever you want to call them, the J.P. Morgans, the Goldman Sachs, they control the bond market. And they're taking European capital in the Northern Union states run by Abraham Lincoln, who's trying to save the United States of America and the Republic as he sees it. Are faced with this conundrum where they have two fronts. They realize that the financiers are trying to make the Union lose the war to create a separation between the North and the South, to allow the South to secede so that they can use divide and conquer to make them then continue to war so that they can reinstitute colonialism or colonialist control over America. Well, what does Abraham Lincoln do? Fortunately for the American population, and unfortunately perhaps for the Muslim population in years down the road, rather than borrow from the bankers, he issues his own currency. So he issues what's called the greenback, what became the dollar. He takes on the bankers, he destroys the bankers, and we know that the rest is history. He had Salmon Chase, his Secretary of the Treasury, advise him on the matter, and he had a very patriotic American bond distributor by the name of J. Cook to go into the domestic residents of the Union and to sell bonds to Americans. So an indigenous effort was made to change the currency, pay the soldiers with the currency, win the war with the currency, and also to finance any borrowing through a person that did a great job for the American system by the name of J. Cook. And so they took on the financiers, they took on the processes of the accumulation of capital, the old European entities, and rather than have a khedive like the Egyptian people had to suffer through, they were fortunate enough to have representation that actually defended their interests, and largely as a consequence of the principles that were embodied in the separation from Britain originally, America went on then thereafter to boom and to develop under the greenback system, and the rest is essentially history. So we have to recognize that that 10-year period of time is something we should fundamentally be able to recognize. Do we consider the Sharia-compliant finance industry as this quote-unquote profit-sharing industry, a mechanism by which we will be able to attain similar developments? I don't think so. I don't think there's any indication that there's any effort to break away from the type of usurious loans that are akin to what Rosa Luxemburg called the accumulation of capital. So today we have a very fundamentally different and distinct process. Now we're supposed to talk about the American system and how the American system works apart from European capital. But that's how European capital worked, and essentially it worked well up until the period between World War I and World War II, which essentially witnessed the complete destruction of the old traditional colonialist entities. So, when does the American empire come into play? Well, it comes into play at the end of World War II, as we said, with the accumulation of 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.5% of the population. And immediately, and now I will go through a summary of another reading that is for this course, which is the book by Michael Hudson called Super Imperialism, which describes in the 7th chapter American strategy within the World Bank. There was a Great Depression between World War I and World War II, and it is actually World War II that pulled the Americans out of their depression, and this was initiated in a process by FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who worked in conjunction with many people in his administration to sort of take a hold of the Wall Street crowd, which had again began to try to wilder and whittle away American threat to British traditional colonialism. Now, the description described in the book by Michael Hudson is excellent, although he's unfortunately a little flawed, and he doesn't make a key identification, which is very crucial, that FDR was a truly progressive administration throughout the duration of its history, whether it's because FDR wanted it to be that way or the people pushed it that way. He did take on the bankers, and he did intend by the Bretton Woods system to create stable exchange rates to end speculation. And he did express an intent to develop the rest of the world, which would have been absolutely, fabulous for the American economy. But he certainly wasn't an old traditional imperialist along the lines of Rosa Luxemburg, although Michael Hudson does a very good job at portraying him as such. But that's something that doesn't need to be argued, because what we're interested in is this process of how this system of old traditional colonialist expansion and in finance imperialism continues today. And it continues with the strategy of formulating the World Bank. So in 1945, of course, the people met, they developed the Bretton Woods system. And in March of 1946, at the close of the initial foundation meetings that formulated the World Bank and the IMF, Secretary Morgenthau, who was the Department of Treasury head under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and who was responsible for investigating bankers like Averell Harriman, Prescott Walker Bush, and other fascists that were contributing to the Nazi war machine. IBM, Wall Street financiers were loaning money to Hitler as he was destroying Europe. And remember, America didn't enter that war until very late into the game. Well, Secretary Morgenthau explained that Bretton Woods was an attempt to try to get away from the concept of control of international finance by private financiers who were not accountable to the people. And Hudson includes a quote where he says that under the leadership of President Roosevelt, I sought for a period of 12 years to move the financial center of the world from London and Wall Street to the United States Treasury, and to compete to create a new concept between nations in international finance. And Hudson goes on to discredit this movement from Wall Street and London to the effort of the United States government to take over as the chief colonialist entity. I happen to think that Mr. Morgenthau was incredibly aware of the necessity of attacking the financial centers as the root cause of the affliction, and that Hudson makes some mistakes in this assessment. But where he goes from there is irrelevant, because in 1945, the World Bank formulation is adulterated because Franklin Delano Roosevelt dies, and a new administration comes in under Harry Truman, who's particularly different than the one that preceded it. And it is in this era that Wall Street is asked to appoint the very first president of the World Bank. And it's a fundamental shift where we wanted under FDR for World Bank first presidential head of the World Bank to be represented by a government official, or someone like Morgenthau, who was not a Wall Street banker, who was not a banker before he worked in the administration, who was an academic. And because the initial bonds that were going to be floated by the World Bank would be highly dependent upon the Wall Street interest in them. Eventually what happens is John McCoy becomes the first World Bank president. And it was stated in the New York Times that the election of John J. McCoy as president of the World Bank is considered a victory for Wall Street and for British theories as to how the bank should have been organized in the first place. McCoy himself confirmed this view when he stated in 1947 that, quote, the necessity of going to private investors for funds, in addition to keeping the bank's management in touch with financial markets, also ensures that its operations will be free of political influence. So the British concept was that there should be no political influence in the World Bank or the IMF, that it should be dependent upon private capital. Well, there's obvious reasons for that, because their system is run by private capital and by financiers. But it's something that most people don't know. The World Bank actually issues bonds on behalf of private capital, so the eventual profiteers from private capital from the World Bank and the loans that they distribute are in fact bankers, and it is provable that they do turn a profit. Although people would say it's a very minute profit, it's all about development. The simple fact of the matter is that we need to look at the role the World Bank plays. Remember, it's not about turning a profit from the loans, it's about creating dependency, according to Rosa Luxemburg. And so these are ultimately the outcomes that come about from World Bank loans. So this system was dependent upon Wall Street and the City of London thereafter in 1945. And immediately in 1945, with the Marshall Plan, they started to rebuild Europe and started loans to less developed countries. So the Marshall Plan was an effort at doing what Rosa Luxemburg suggested was one of the primary phases of this imperialist expansion and the accumulation of capital, which was to create dependencies through loans. So the World Bank became the rebuilder of Europe to create a counter to the American system, or to help to redevelop the old colonialist entities, and none of the likes of development like a Marshall Plan was offered to any of the other areas of the world that were destroyed. So what it did was it created the world we see today. We talk about the north versus the southern hemispheres, but we really talk about the majority of wealth being allocated between America and Europe. It still accounts for about the same percentage, of which George Kennan stated 6.5% of the population, yet 50% of the entire known resources of the world. It still accounts for the same when we account it properly. So the World Bank becomes the means by which capital accumulation is put to use for expansion across the globe. And that's what goes on immediately after the rebuilding of Europe. The system and the World Bank is basically adulterated. So there was a stimulus program, there was a sort of a real development program in the Marshall Plan, and then all of a sudden, as soon as Europe is rebuilt, the World Bank starts to promote the doctrine of free trade. Well, we call free trade imperialism, and for very good reason. Basically, the way that it worked was that they would create a process by which less developed countries would go with loans to agricultural and industrial dependencies, and their gold reserves by borrowing under the Bretton Woods system would be depleted, and so the only thing that they would really have on hand would be dollar bills and their own currency, which was pegged to dollar bills. They were completely indoctrinated and entered into a system through World Bank loans and ownership into a free trade imperialism, or what you would call the implementation of a commodity economy, creating the way for which all traditional systems could be uprooted, and for the continuous rape of Latin America, of Africa, and eventually the Middle East as well. And Hudson says in his book, the result of this free trade imperialism, he says, quote, the result has been that the division of the world is now into developed and impoverished countries has increased since World War II. Not only have the underdeveloped countries failed to embark upon self-sustaining growth, they have failed even to increase food output in keeping with their population growth. During the 1960s, their per capita food output even declined 2%. In the non-communist industrial countries, it increased 11%. The industrial nations thus have increased their productivity advantage over the poorer countries in agriculture as well as in manufacturers. As a result, the overall U.S. trade surplus in agricultural products increased during the 1960s, even as its trade balance in industrial manufacturers was deteriorating. Meanwhile, most agriculturally backward countries have seen their food deficits increase. So this notion that these loans from the World Bank in the 1960s were going to liberate people and make them food sufficient actually created food dependencies. And as there was subsidized and non-free trade practices in America, these subsidized agricultural farmers in the Midwest were able to have surplus product that could then be inserted into free trade zones in countries where their goods could compete with the locally developed farmed goods. And because farmers were not allowed to industrialize, the system created a complete imbalance that actually watched rich countries get richer and poor countries get poorer. And Hudson makes a very convincing argument that this was in fact deliberate. And so what it did was it would not allow the development of ag industry. And what it did allow was for the development of industry. So it basically, the World Bank in the 1950s and 60s was responsible for creating the industrialization of a key city that would create human capital flight away from agricultural districts into major urban metropolises, but they were not skilled laborers, so it would create overpopulation, pollution, and conditions of squalor. But through that migration, it would create the disintegration of agriculture, which would create dependencies, which would uproot a tradition, take the peasants away from their traditional communities and put them in an urban environment. And the whole process by which Rosa Luxemburg described continued under World Bank loans in the 1940s, 1950s. And Hudson says what's important is to build up the capacity of underdeveloped countries to produce goods and services. So then, by industrializing debtors to the World Bank model, the same thing occurs. The bank should start from this point rather than from the measurement of foreign currency needs. And if development succeeds, the transfer problem of meeting the debt charges should take care of itself. At present, the bank puts the cart of foreign exchange difficulties before the horse of economic development. So they're more worried about maintaining currency stability than they are about creating the conditions under which economic development can occur. And this system went on for quite some time, up until the fact when America entered into its Vietnam War era, 1967 era, in which America finds itself losing in war. By 1971, the system changes, and the Bretton Woods model of pegged currencies is obliterated, and what you have is a floating system of what we call post-Bretton Woods, where there's no pegging to gold of any product. Well, in between this, the policy of the 70s and the 80s, and then before it became the Washington Consensus in the 1990s, was all about population control. The idea was that by industrializing and transferring technology from corporations in the West through World Bank loans to Africa and Latin America and other countries like them, that basically you could prevent what was identified as the big problem of population control. And what we often see when we look at the history of World Bank progressions is that we see the worst warmongers as the head. Paul Wolfowitz was the president of the World Bank during Bush's era. Well, the secretary of the World Bank during the 1970s was none other than Robert McNamara, who was a complete war hawk, who was responsible for the warmongering of the Vietnam War era, and once Vietnam War proved to be a failure, was not demoted by any way, shape, or form for his extreme warmongering and his annihilation of the people of Vietnam, but was instead promoted to become president of the World Bank, and he immediately begins to conduct an operation whereby basically there was the stated intention of population control or the prevention of population growth. Well, that went on until the 1990s when we had the introduction of neoliberal policies. This is a very summarized version. I'm running out of time. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to keep it. There's only 3 people anyway, so I'll cut it a little short. But an interesting read is another document that's in the course pack, which is a document called the National Security Memorandum 200, which is a document that was penned and researched by Henry Kissinger, who was a good friend of Robert McNamara, and who stated, it wasn't released until 1989, this document, but now we know that the policy of the United States was to keep 13 key countries that the United States thought had a, quote, special political and strategic interest from developing their populations, or from developing their populations in a route that could witness them utilize their own resources. And Kissinger included the countries of India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines, Turkey, Nigeria, Egypt, Ethiopia, Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia. So you notice that 10 out of those 13 are actually Muslim majority countries. And it claimed that population growth, NSM 200, claimed in conjunction with McNamara changing the system of the World Bank, claimed that population growth in those states was worrisome since it could increase their own political, economic, and military strength. So, for example, the section that Kissinger outlines about Nigeria, he says, it's already the most populous country on the African continent. It has an estimated 55 million people in 1970. Nigeria's population by the end of this century is projected to number 135 million. This suggests a growing political and strategic role for Nigeria, at least in Africa. So he's not worried about overpopulation because the people aren't going to eat. He's worried about them consuming their own resources. He says if we allow them to develop to 135 million people, then there will be an increasing role for the Nigerians in political and strategic avenues in Africa. And then he says about Brazil, Brazil clearly dominated the continent demographically, and he warned about Brazil, saying that the growing power status for Brazil in Latin America and on the world scene over the next 25 years is something to worry about. So the problem is not one of population growth. The problem, and it's not one of lack of food today, or this concept that we still have from the greenies or from the environmentalist freaks that don't know anything about, the reality of the world. It's not one of production and lack of production or lack of potential production. It's one of distribution. And that's essentially what the World Bank set out to cement. Well, there was one opposition to it during the run-up to the Israeli war of 1967 war in Israel, between Israel and the Arab states, and then the 1973 Arab-Israeli war. There was a king in Saudi Arabia by the name of Faisal who put an embargo in both instances on Saudi exports of oil to the United States for supporting Israel. And one of the things that's interesting to note about probably the reason that he was killed, and we'll talk more about this in the week that we identify Saudi complicity in this system of neo-imperialism. One of the reasons that he was probably assassinated was because he wanted to engage in a policy called Operation Breadbasket, by which he wanted to take the money from the oil proceeds and he didn't want to invest it back into the United States or in Wall Street or in the city of London. And instead what he wanted to do was he wanted to develop Africa, and he wanted to start with the Sudan, and he said he wanted to make it the breadbasket of the Middle East. Basically, he wanted to irrigate it so that it would grow enough wheat to supply all of the Muslim world so that no Muslim woman had to go, a Muslim man, woman, or child had to go hungry. And Kissinger, of course, opposed this. Just so happens that the brother that assassinated King Faisal, or the cousin, that assassinated King Faisal was a protege of American CIA operations, and was a student for quite some time in California, where he was involved in research into LSD and hallucinogenic experimentation while living abroad in America, and went on to assassinate Faisal as one of the only people that had access to him. And it was thereafter that Kissinger and William E. Simon, a member of the Nixon administration, met with the follower of Faisal, the late King Fahd, to discuss what we called the petrodollar system earlier, of the petrodollar recycling, where all of the money that's generated from the proceeds of oil miraculously makes its way back into New York City banks and investments in Wall Street and the City of London, the two financial houses of the world. Well, since 1990, we've had the Washington Consensus, which is a series of structural adjustment policies which advocates for privatization for all of the countries that enter into World Bank loans. So it's very important to understand that no longer do we have traditional old European capitalism. Today, through the World Bank and the IMF system, essentially we have a reproduction of the processes that were stated and defined as imperialism and colonialism by Rosa Luxemburg many years earlier. So in fact, the American process post-1945 is not different in any way, shape, or form from its European colonialist, other than that it comes through something that is projected as the United Nations, which is a transnational institution. And these transnational institutions are projected as liberal development policies coming out of the catastrophe that was World War I and World War II. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. Today, under the Washington Consensus, we have structural adjustment policies, and now we have an institution called the G20, which was created by the failure of neoliberal policies in the East Asian crisis, 1990s, and it was created by the United States Treasury, which basically continues to meet from time to time in order to promote the idea that this neoliberal model will accrue. So neoliberalism is neo-imperialism, and neoliberalism is something that we are presently witnessing an effort to try to rebuild today. And the way that it works is that the Federal Reserve is able to print dollars at will, and the dollar is the global reserve currency, not attached to gold at all. So through the bond market and through the fact that private central banks all across the world have to own dollar bills, what you have is you have a dollar-dominated form of imperialism that is now embarked upon. Almost the entire world is covered by nation states, and almost every nation state has an independent central bank. These independent central banks have to hold dollars because of the floating exchange rates, and because of the floating exchange rates, they basically are subject to speculation and manipulation at the hands of foreign financiers. Central banks have to hold dollars in case they have to go into the market and create false demand or supply, or false demand for their currency in order to keep it propped up in case of economic catastrophe. So it's through the bond market that capitalists with surplus value accumulated or able to dictate processes of the unfolding of the continued expansion of imperialism to the point where globalization represents a return to something that was last recognized right before it blew up the world and created the Great Depression, and then ultimately war in Europe. And again, we're heading in the direction where with a globalized model, we have two options. We can either fix things similar to the last way they were fixed, which was by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, by taking away the financial speculators, attacking them, changing the rules, setting up systems that confront them, or we can witness the development of the world moving in the direction of World War III. So at the head of the financial slime mold today that really dictates policy in the world, we have independent central banking and fractional reserve lending. It's very interesting to note that in the time where there existed in America what was called the Glass-Steagall Act, which represented the taxation of speculative investment, separation of commercial banking from investment banking, Wall Street, to show just how much it really is a derivative London operation, took most of its capital and manipulated it and put it in the City of London, which is operating very much like an offshore center where it did not adhere to Glass-Steagall tendencies. It shunned all American intervention and was able, in the period from World War II and the development of the World Bank and its being able to manipulate and retake over processes of the IMF and the World Bank, was then able to take the capital that was accumulating on the City of London to set up island operations of offshore banking that are now responsible for maintaining this system of financial domination. So it's very important that we mention that too. But basically, what we have today under the quote-unquote American system of the American system of empire is really a financial system of empire domination, which is occurring at the hands of transnational capital flows, usually that have their origin in transnational banks and institutions that are able to manipulate not only currencies but manipulate development by creating a system of dollar-dominated debt servitude that we would call contemporary globalization, which actually crashed in 2008, but through what we saw earlier in the video, the manipulation and the reinsertion of debt to alter some of those balances, and now to return those balances by taking the heavy rate of unemployment and force them back into the labor market at lower wages to start the process all over again. What we see is efforts to restart an economy, but really no results ultimately coming about from the latest round of policy, which includes quantitative easing 2, $600 million worth of printing of American dollars floated into the economy at 1% interest rate so that they can be invested all over the world, which is essentially giving free money to the bankers so that they can buy up the assets of the world. Something that was very craftily stated by a person by the name of Sir Josiah Stamp, one of the first directors of the Bank of England, who stated. I don't know if it's attributed, if we can really say it's him. There's no proof that it's a quote, but he said the problem with usurious banking and fractional reserve lending policies is that bankers will print up enough money to buy back the world again if they ever go bankrupt. And that's essentially the process that you see unfolding today. So the accumulation of capital is described by Rosa Luxemburg in its imperialist phase due to international usurious loans is today the same process by which the bond market, capitalists, surplus value holders, and now no longer factory owners are people that are responsible for the means of production and ownership of the means of production. But today they're just financiers. They just have capital currencies and investments that have accumulated over generations. Well, they sit at the head of a big imperialist process that is now termed globalization, under an ideology that is the same as described by Rosa Luxemburg, but we call neoliberalism. The other book that we had to read for today's discussion was by John Perkins. I think it's called The American Secret History of the American Empire. I'm not so sure John Perkins is someone that should be considered absolutely reliable. I think he's a little bit of a conspiracy theorist. I think he got caught up in a culture and attributed it largely to some of his stories are a little bit unbelievable for me. I'm sorry, I just speak how I think. I'm not saying he's wrong, but he's definitely someone that should be listened to. Started to become very prominent when he wrote a book called Economic Hitman, described the process by which he would work for private firms which would go in and do investigations for developmental projects that would eventually be funded by World Bank loans in developing countries. And he talks a lot about the process of East Asia, identifying first and foremost Indonesia. And he says that Indonesia, like other countries, looked like everything was going good. From statistics from the 1990s, 1980s, showed that all of the development in Indonesia was advancing a rapid prosperity within society, but that in fact, in 1997, the whole thing blew apart during the East Asian crisis, and that a major role of this was international debt in crashing the Indonesian economy. And he states about it that, quote, its debt service, Indonesia, plus short-term debt as a percentage of foreign reserves averaged close to a whopping 300% during the 1990 to 1996 period, compared to about 120% for Thailand, 60% for China, 25% for Hong Kong and Taiwan, and the figure is not available for Singapore. He says it was clear that we had burdened this country with such staggering amounts of debt that it could not possibly repay them. Indonesians were forced to redeem themselves by satisfying the desires of our corporations. So the Indonesian economy was very interesting because all of these loans that were taken out, and he says that they were 300% above their average foreign reserve holdings in debt, which is phenomenal, were all taken out by a person by the name of Suharto, who was put in power and came to power by a CIA coup under the Ford administration, with none other than Henry Kissinger visiting the country of Indonesia before 24 hours before Henry Kissinger and Gerald Ford were in Indonesia talking to Suharto, and they authorized the complete massacre of 500,000 East Timorese people. Suharto comes to power in Indonesia, and he basically begins this process of staggering growth. Well, the reason that staggering growth is because under neoliberal policies, they're essentially fascist policies. The workers live in concentration camp-like conditions, and the growth is due to the extraction of surplus value at the exploitation of the labor force. Indonesia, like other East Asian powers, was one of the first to deal with this. So the Asian crisis came about in 1997. Suharto was overthrown in a similar way to what we see happening in Egypt and Tunisia today. The East Asian crisis is very similar in many ways. Suharto was overthrown because in 1997, as the crisis comes to fruition, he agrees through World Bank and IMF dictates to float exchange rates, to dictate a repeal of subsidies, to end public services, to implement austerity measures, and to pay back this staggering debt that John Perkins identified, and to open up the Indonesian economy to further foreign penetration. Well, the people had enough because they were already suffering, and he was condemning, an additional couple 100,000 people to die by implementing austerity measures at a time of depression. And this is basically what goes on. I mean, structural adjustment policies force you to privatize everything, but they also prevent you from engaging in any type of government-funded social development, something that America and traditional European powers would never even imagine at all. And so what we see is, remember, Rosa Luxemburg basically said that these countries are indebted, and people continue to invest in these processes, even up to the point where you get a situation like Indonesia where there's a dictator, so you know that you want to create bankruptcy because the dictator is going to default, and once the dictator defaults, he's not going to declare default and let all his wealth dissipate. In fact, he's going to honor the debt, let the World Bank, IMF dictate the policy, and then extract through strongman policies an ability to pay back by attacking that variable component that we saw during the video that represents a increase in surplus value the more you can press down the variable cost. And so that's something that is recurrent, and we're just talking about Indonesia as a case today because this is all done under World Bank loans, IMF manipulation. Well, in 1997, 1998, early 1998, the elite members that were once loyal to the Suharto regime engaged in protests that were similar to those we've seen recently in Egypt and Tunisia, and they forced President Suharto to step down after 30 years of dictatorship and policy. But the interesting thing to note is that still today Indonesia is paying back the debt that was accrued under Suharto, even though it would probably be safe to say that the Suharto investments, because of course he didn't invest in his own country, he did like the other Arab dictators did, in order to keep himself in World Bank favor, he put all of his money in Wall Street and in foreign Swiss accounts, etc., etc. Oh, Indonesians are still paying back this debt today. They have democratic elections, but they've basically been forced to continue to adhere to World Bank dictation. A study in 1998 by World Bank resident staff in Indonesia estimated that, quote, at least 20 to 30% of the government of Indonesia's development budget funds are diverted through informal payments to government staff and politicians. There's no basis to claim a small leakage for bank projects, as our controls have little practical effort on the methods generally used. So this data shows that the bank, by its own account, knew that none of the money that they were issuing in loans was going to actually projects, that 20 to 30% was being embezzled and adopted by the dictator and those in bed with the dictatorship. And so now what we see in post-revolution Indonesia after Suharto is more democratic in political structures, but the economic landscape remains the same. The Suharto family and his old cronies from the regime control most of the banks, and the policies are supported by what they call the Consultative Group of Indonesia, the CGI, which is like a network of companies and old traditional colonialist heads that basically make all of the macroeconomic decisions in the country. This is exactly what you're going to see happen in Egypt, Tunisia, and perhaps Libya if they get their way there, as long as the Muslim Ummah stays asleep and doesn't understand how it was that Egypt is still a colonialist entity today, but America is now the dominant imperialist power in the world. Being able to address the financial imperialists is of utmost importance for anyone that wants actual liberation. So we'll move on and we'll talk a little bit about a very important state, and then we'll end for today. This process of imperialism has really been a key component of the Malaysian experience. Of course, an interesting thing about the post-World War II American empire environment is that we have this notion of a decolonization. So all of the old territories of the French and the British were allegedly granted sovereignty and independence through struggles. But Malaysia and Indonesia is very similar, but requires another conversation. It really is exemplary when we discuss the way that the old colonialist powers maintain control of economics, and the economy and finance especially, but sacrificed political control to allegedly indigenous political alternatives or revolutionary decolonialist eras. Malaysia was restructured as the Federation of Malay in 1948 after World War II, and then it was granted independence it was an old British colony. It was granted independence in 1957. One of the best natural resources in Malaysia are vast. There's a big rubber, there's big tin. We now see that the Malaysian economy has developed due to some anti-colonialist measures as a home to science, tourism, commerce, and the medical field. But essentially, the way that the decolonialization process in Malaysia unfolded is indicative of how people and the powers that be remain in control. Malaysia's probably chief radical political economist by the name of Jomo, K.S. Jomo, coined a key phrase in Malaysia during the 1960s where he said, politics for the Malays and an economy for the Chinese. But it's noted that this statement was pretty much false, and that this dissident was very much not able to identify the real root of the problem. And this is the chief radical political economist in a country. So it shows you really how insidious and how crafty the realm of finance can actually be in retaining control. This assessment that the economy of Malaysia was run by the Chinese ruled out the reality that there was a major domination of the national economy in the 1960s, 1970s era by foreign capital, by the influence of capital over political decisions, so there really was no such thing as politics for the Malays either, and by the systemic constraints on the scope for state intervention. By being indebted and by being financially dictated by foreign capital, they were really unable to develop their own society by all of the protectionist mechanisms that have developed any successful sovereign nation state since they were concocted as the primary system of organization in the world. In the early years after independence in Malaysia, the post-colonial state continued to serve the interest of particularly British capital and its old foreign associates. The governing stratum, spawned by the colonial state, had little reason to be distrusted by the hegemonic fraction of the bourgeois or foreign expatriate capital. So what you had in Malaysia was you had what we would term administrators of capital, which were expatriates of old traditional European capital, and which led to the miscalculation of the dissident in bed with Chinese capital. So you had foreign capital, which was formulating dominant groupings that represented a continuation of British and Chinese colonial power over the country. They set up many networks of privilege, I guess you could say. The tin and rubber industries of Malaysia were completely dominated, by the most part, by networks of interlocking directorships and managerial arrangements between corporate expatriates that were living in Malaysia on behalf of the British. And this basically allowed the conglomeration of all proceeds from the natural resources to formulate big British trading and investment companies that were called agency houses. It allowed them to basically control vast assets in the primary. Yes, it's true. Vast assets in primary production. And to complete the network that the British business operations set up, these agency houses were linked to exchange banks. So like the traders and the agencies themselves, the bankers retained their regional headquarters after Malayan independence. So they never kicked out the the bankers from the scene. And they also the bankers had a network of branches throughout the Malaysian system, not only in Kuala Lumpur but in other commercial centers. So, for example, the big four British banks that were there was Chartered Bank of India, Australia, and China. So, Chartered Bank, the Eastern Bank, and HSBC, Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, which is not a Chinese operation. It's a British operation responsible for running the proceeds from the opium trade that we will definitely talk about with regard to a major player in the Sharia compliant finance field today. And then also the Mercantile Bank of India. So there's four major players, but the British financial sector was concentrated during the early years of Malayan independence as Chartered took over Eastern, and HSBC took over Mercantile. So by 1959, you had a consolidation in these British entities, and HSBC and what's now Standard Chartered basically took over control over the entire banking apparatuses in the Malay economy. So British business interest in Malaysia definitely did not suffer in any way, shape, or form from the ending of empire as proclaimed by quote, advocates of decolonization. Actually, according to a study by the University of Cambridge, the post-tax profitability of UK capital in Malaysia between 1955 and 1964 was 19.8% a year, and which was the second most profitable destination for British investments after, it says, West Germany. So this is basically something that set up a system by which the traditional roots of imperialism were continued, but there was this nominal granting of political independence, which is something that is quite potentially possible coming out of these Middle Eastern uprisings. In May of 1961, Tunku Abdul Rahman started to announce his desire to bring Malaysia closer together with Singapore, which was originally supposed to be a component of the Malaysian decolonial process, but was separate. And he wanted to bring into the Malaysian system Singapore, Sarawak, North Borneo, and Brunei, or we say Brunei, in political and economic cooperation. And this is when before Suharto in Indonesia, there was a president by the name of Sukarno, who was very much a socialist and identified properly the Greater Malaysian project as nothing more than efforts by neo-colonialists to retain control over the entire region. Well, he was soon taken care of, rapidly replaced with the dictator Suharto, funded by the CIA, and leading to a massive massacre by Suharto in East Timor. And the fundamental distinction that we have is, fortunately for the Malays, they did have an experience under about 20 years of rule by the UMNO under Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, which was able to effectively counter these attacks, frequently criticized in the press for this Malay policy of protecting the Malaysian people and trying to do away with some of this accumulation of capital into the hands of expatriates. Mahathir ibn Mohamad was able to revolutionize and alter the Malaysian economy so that they do have things like economic, technological development today, by putting sort of even operating inside of a system that is antithetical to internal development using the state. He was able to engage in such practices, and when the crises came and hit Malaysia too during part of the East Asian crises, it was Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, Malaysia's prime minister then, that protected Malaysia by not making its currency available for foreign speculators like George Soros to buy, so that they could cover a short sale position in the mechanisms by which people are able to sort of decimate whole economies, the speculators or the bond vigilantes, as they're oftentimes called. And so that's an important lesson, because alongside of this development, as the Iraq War unfolded several years later, the capital controls that were instituted by Muhammad ibn Muhammad, which run completely antithetical to the IMF, now they're issuing policy declarations based upon this policy that he engaged in, rescuing the economy from speculators. That suggests that capital controls, or basically controlling your currency, controlling your economy, may be necessary in the event, yes, George Soros, the speculator, in the event of, I lost my train of thought, I'm sorry. I looked at the screen and was reading the chat. Anyway, moving on. Muhammad ibn Muhammad also, by engaging in these capital controls, now the IMF is changing. They're issuing papers that say capital controls are sometimes necessary. So we do know that this policy is espoused as this free trade liberalism, this neoliberalism. It's a failure, and it's a re-implementation, and it's a resynthesization of Rosa Luxemburg's processes described in her book Accumulation of Capital, and it continues to go on today. So everywhere that you look, the process of decolonialization led to World Bank, IMF dependencies. Process is still unfolding today. The Arab uprisings that are occurring today in the Muslim world as a reaction to Western policies, which include rising inflation due to quantitative easing 2 programs, are not necessarily revolutionary in and of their own selves. The fact of the matter is that if you want to see the process of imperialism continue to play out, just look at Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt, and the reaction since. The Tunisian economy is in the tanks. The Egyptian economy is predicting that it will go into the tanks. They're losing most of the dollars that they're holding in their central bank reserves. The idea is to make them suffer economically, so they have to run to the World Bank, the IMF, for loans. And Tunisia just signed a $500 million loan with the World Bank, despite the fact that it doesn't even have elected representation. It doesn't even have a functioning government. Egypt is in discussions through its central bank, despite the fact that its government was allegedly basically abolished and it's under temporary rule of the army. They're already in negotiations with the World Bank and the IMF and the U.S. Secretary of State to take out loans. And look at Libya, where you have the Transitional Federation Council, a University of Washington professor suddenly appears, having lived abroad for 20 years, on the scene within 1 week of arriving in Libya and gaining Western support for quote-unquote rebels. He sets up a private central bank. Within another week, he's able to promise that any oil that's in eastern Libya will be sold through Dubai on the international exchange. And so we see already preparations of economic retention of control are being set in force, and everyone's going to talk about the opportunity to vote in a democratic process and how everything is going lovely, and the process of debt imperialism continues on the international scheme of things. Well, having talked about that and that process, having identified, I mean, this topic needs to really be covered in a course in and of itself. We have to talk about the solution. The interesting concept of Sharia compliant finance and the interesting system of Islam as an ability to counter this is that in its role of protection against speculation. Most people identify the Islamic economy as being totally dependent upon its prohibition of riba, or its prohibition of interest. But another beautiful component of the Islamic economy is actually its prohibition of what we call gharar. And gharar is very oftentimes translated as speculation, but in fact, closer look at speculation in general. Speculation is part of any investment that a person makes. So we wouldn't want to translate gharar as speculation. It would be better to translate it as deceit or ambiguity. And the system under Islam offers a very, very powerful system that could create some form of sort of counter akin to what FDR did in many ways. That's a lecture in and of itself too, but there's a very progressive tendency that has been unrealized before in the history of the Ummah, which could very easily represent a process by which we could rescue ourselves in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Malaysia, Indonesia, any place that's able to break away from the international order very easily by instituting a macroeconomic system based on Sharia compliant finance. You could very easily create an alternative model, because what effectively was done by FDR was to remove the rampant speculation, not all speculation, but rampant speculation. And the prohibition of gharar allows us to do that under the Islamic model. The examples in the hadith of gharar are like selling birds in the sky, or the fish in a cast net of water, an unborn animal, the catch of one net throw. Is basically like risk, and it would be very applicable to the world of risk that we see today. Yes, we have a question and answer, and fiat paper money in Islam is something that requires a very long conversation, and we want to keep on the idea of colonialism. The point of the fact is that in the post-1971 era, where there's no more pegging of the dollar bill to gold, and where all of the currencies, they fluctuate in relative to each other, the point is that speculation is rampant, and it's these capital flows that very important for anyone serious about economic study to read Thomas Friedman's book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree. He calls it the electronic herd, where traders on Wall Street and City of London can essentially bring down entire countries just by putting in a substantial order for buy or sale in the international bond market because of speculation. But speculation based on things they don't own. And so through short sales and other financial manipulations, through credit default swaps, through derivatives trading, the entire system, a global economy that has completely become financialized, the speculative instruments that allow people to speculate, if you add all the derivatives contracts, credit default swap contracts in the world, they're actually like 20 times larger than the actual physical economy. So gharar is not just eliminating the riba. The most important aspect of the Islamic economy, if you want to prevent neo-imperialism, is to have a system that is based on gharar. And that way you wouldn't have currency speculation. You'd necessitate that there would be a peg to currencies. The other thing is with the work of Dr. Mahathir ibn Mohamad, which we'll talk about again, Dr. Mahathir ibn Mohamad has called for a system of fiat currencies, but current account settlements between Muslim countries should be settled, he says, in a gold dinar system. So there would be some form of basic return to a fixed exchange rate system, and current account settlements would transfer gold from one country to another based upon deficit or surplus at the end of a trading period. Something that could create the potential for gradual return to a commodity economy and sabotage what we have as the ultimate vision of imperialists with the manifestation of the complete accumulation of capital of the global economy. The IMF system of special drawing rights is the alternative fiat order that would challenge. So this is a lecture that we're going to actually get into, but we have identified tonight the process of old traditional European colonialism. I hope that I've tried a little bit, as best I really could, to connect that model as defined by Rosa Luxemburg to the model described by Michael Hudson in the book Super Imperialism, the World Bank IMF dominated model coming out of World War II, where America realized that it was the dominant power. That through the examples that I've given of Malaysia and Indonesia, the decolonialist process merely transferred power from gave nominal independence, but political independence, never economic independence. And where the British Empire was challenged, it was challenged by the American power system. For example, in Egypt, Jamal Abdel Nasser was the result of a CIA coup on behalf of getting the British influence out of Egypt so that the Americans could take over. They proceeded to engage in all sorts of propaganda, including opening up a radio station so that Nasser could promote anti-American rhetoric. But the speeches that he was given were, in fact, written for him by the CIA. Same is true of Suharto, who everyone, the New York press certainly didn't report at all. The book Manufacturing Consent is largely dependent upon facts accrued by Herman and Chomsky with regard to the lack of press coverage of the East Timor massacre and these things that we learn later on in time that come from Washington themselves and from CIA coups are akin to what Rosa Luxemburg classified as, she said that war is not the consequence of warring nations. Rosa Luxemburg said that war is a consequence of attempting to break away from the dominant capitalist order, if you will. That's as true for Sukarno, who was critical of the development of the Malayan conglomerate and the inclusion of Singapore into the Malaysian independence movement, and classifying it rightfully so as a false revolutionary endeavor and a neo-colonialist experience. And when we look at the systems that are offered by Sharia-compliant finance, we realize that today they emulate and contribute to this process of allocating the wealth accrued from dictatorship and from authoritarianism so that it can be inserted into the global economy in a way that puts on the front and the fraud of Islamic economics. Were we really concerned with creating a truly functionable Sharia-compliant finance industry, we'd realize that it can only function in a macro environment that does not accept imperialism, with floating exchange rates, with a system of fiat money that's dominating the world, with these adherence to organizations like the IMF, the World Trade Organization, and the World Bank, which basically gives up the sovereignty of any of the Muslim countries alone. There is no way that any paradigmatic challenge will ever be identified and exposed. And so what really we must in the coming period of time understand is, we talked tonight about the fundamental difference between the Egyptian experience post 1850 up until the present day and the American experience from 1850 through its civil war and now to the world's greatest power, in that the fundamental distinction was that there was an awareness and an ability to break away from internal manipulations and efforts to manipulate by international financiers. It is for this very reason that at some point in time this ummah, when it does resurrect itself, will have to realize something the great Da'i Sheikh Said Qutb once said, that it is imperative that Islam take a concrete role in the society. Sayyid Qutb rahimahullah ta'ala said that Islam cannot fulfill its role except by taking concrete form in a society, rather in a nation, for man does not listen, especially in this age, to an abstract theory which is not seen materialized in a living society. It's interesting to note that as much as we might despise and disagree with some of the moves that have been made by the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, they have made a fundamentally important distinction, although it needs modification. They have announced that they will run on a platform. They're going to contest more than 30% or 40% of the seats, as stated before, and they've formulated a new political party, but they've also announced that they're going to advocate for the issuance of sukuk bonds to their own populations. Now, if we were able to teach them the history of foreign intervention in America and the way that Jay Cook sold bonds on behalf of the Lincoln administration, and the way that they were able to win a civil war, and we were able to get that information to them, and we were able to describe them an alternative, well then, we'd have an opportunity to develop Islam in a concrete form in the society. But we as an ummah must become aware of neo-colonialist processes. It's akin to what the then great scholar Safar al-Hawali said when the Islamic awakening was first taking root in Saudi Arabia. He identified the victory of Afghanistan over the Soviets. He said that we, the youth of Islam, were able to dismantle the circle of subservience to the West. We were able to reject its deceiving civilization. We were able to know its conspiracies. But so far, we don't know the reality of who we are. I am surprised that the vanguards of the Islamic call think that the religion of Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah is about theoretical propositions relating to the unknown world, rather than a call for reform and change. In the event that we are unable to mount a complete, comprehensive call for reform and change, and we continue to stay mired in theological disputation, then we will not be able to create what Sayyid Qutb rightfully identified as a necessary precursor to the revival of this ummah, the development of Islam in a concrete form. Economics plays a major role in that, and the only effective economics deals with advocating for a system that does not tolerate imperialism, which is essentially the economics of Satan. we've identified a little bit, and we'll revisit it as time goes on, about the system of gharar that must be understood alongside of riba, because riba is the way by which people that don't contribute anything can reap immense reward, but gharar is the way by which control is emphasized and utilized within an ever-expanding imperialist system. Today we're dealing with a globalized world where this imperialist system almost came tumbling down. The only way that you will be able to unrealize the return to the processes described in the video on the accumulation of capital and a resetting of the system of accumulation of capital, a bailing out and a pushing down of labor through reduced wages and humiliating more and more people of the global population to exploitation to continue to feed a parasitic neo-imperialist order, is if you can develop an alternative. That's why these discussions, we continue to have them, despite the fact that few show up. We record them. We do believe that we'll be able to educate the Ummah in the coming couple of years so that we can get people on this page to develop a platform. And we think that these conversations, inshallah ta'ala, will be important in allowing a resource in the English language to exist by which comprehensive variables can be identified around the Sharia compliant finance industry. But we also have to mention that there is moves in the proper direction. There will be the second international conference on riba coming up here in another couple months. I implore everyone to start to educate people inside of the Ummah about the reality of the Sharia compliant finance industry as a component of neo-imperialism and a contributor to it, to identify the mechanisms and to understand first and foremost the mechanisms of neo-imperialism, and to then understand the Islamic tradition and how the Islamic system can counter neo-imperialism and create a system that's just and fair, not for all in a Marxist sense, but for the majority. And the charity and the zakat system that is relegated and evident inside of Islam should take care of the rest. That's the end of tonight's discussion, but I have enough time for Q&A. I think that we've gone on for a long time, but you're free to answer questions. Let me grab a cup of water, and I can elaborate on any of the principles mentioned tonight. Tonight should have been a 10-week course in and of itself. I hope people understand that. I see there's messages from me, but I don't know how to use WizIQ. So if you've sent me a private message, I'm trying to open it. I can't do it. So anyway, that's enough. But you can type your questions in. We have one from the website. I hope Abdurrahman can grab it because I can't open up the website because it slows down my connection speed. So, yep, inshallah. Give me 2 minutes and we'll start with that one. We'll get out of here. I think we've been well over 2 hours. It's very hard to cover this in a very short period of time. I hope all the listeners understand, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum. Be back in 2 minutes. Okay. All of the readings for tonight's lecture that they're based on, much of this lecture is merely a process of reading and discovering, connecting the dots. The readings that are associated with this week's discussion, I'll email them to anyone that wants them. The course pack, this is week 6. They're very important. Very, very, very important for understanding neo-imperialist processes. And I think that the most important thing the Ummah needs is an understanding of this topic, to be honest with you. I think it is I do agree with Rosa Luxemburg when she says that war is actually the outcome of anybody that tries to break away from the system. I think most of war, you can see in the Taliban, an example of some regime that tried to break away from the system. You can see Iraq in Saddam Hussein's effort to take the dollar off of the petrodollar system apart by selling oil for euros rather than dollars, a threat to the system. And I do believe that war can be traced predominantly over the last 300-year period of time at least, if not before then, to a process of someone trying to break away from the accumulation of global capital. And so this is a very important topic for all that are interested in understanding how to solve the great problems that face humanity and the Ummah today. First question: large amount of debt matters only when the country has to pay back the debt. America never pays back any debts. Even if America defaults all the debt, who has the power to hold it accountable? With dollar being the global currency, it's a win-win situation. Could you kind of elaborate how debt harms the United States? Okay. Well, the system is one where debt doesn't necessarily harm the United States, but there is the reason that the United States can print dollars at will is because they are the global reserve currency. So you oftentimes find that the majority of central banks, they don't sign any form of they don't have any form of real commodity related functions in their central bank holdings. They don't hold gold, they don't hold silver, they don't hold large majorities of it. Now, increasingly, India, Mexico, China, the BRICS countries generally are holding more and more of the commodities like gold and silver, but ultimately, most of what foreign countries have to hold is dollar bills. And when foreign countries have to hold dollar bills, the reason that they have to hold them in their central banks and literally hold them, they can't put them to productive use, is because of the floating exchange rate system of the post-1971 era. Because if someone speculates on your currency, right, then if you can't sell bonds in the market, then you have to use your dollars to buy your own. That's what's happening in Egypt right now. So you have to hold dollars as basically the gold of a fiat system so that you can buy your own debt in the event that you start to face economic turmoil. The other contributing factor to the dollar not having to worry about running excessive debts is that it runs the world's biggest military. And then the third contributing factor to that is the petrodollar system, whereby all of the oil in the international exchanges is sold and denominated in dollar bills, along with most of the commodities that are traded in the world. What this creates is an opportunity for America to print or to go into as much debt as it wants. Debt can potentially harm the United States, however, because what you get, you don't have a problem with debt, but you have a problem with inflation. And what you have now is you have the beginning of these currency wars where you have the Americans at 1% interest rates, the European Central Bank at 1% interest rates, which allows banks, through the nature of the issuance of money into the system, because the governments don't issue money in ways that they used to or ways that could be productive, like through infrastructural development projects. Instead, what they do is they issue money through the commercial banking sectors. And the banks and the speculators and the investment houses are first dibs, cheap credit. And what we were told when they bailed out the banks in the midst of the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers was that they needed to bail out the banks so that John and Sally on Main Street could get loans. And in reality, when we look at capital flows, the efforts to get loans to John and Sally on Main Street have been completely decimated, and all of the money that's being floated into the system through all of the mechanisms taken by the Federal Reserve in America now is making its way overseas, which is creating things like carry trade phenomenon, whereby you borrow for 1% in America, invest for 8% in Brazil. As a result, it's creating massive imbalances, and as a result, it's also creating massive inflation. Not in America, because this system allows America deleveraging at home, while allowing paper to be printed to buy assets and to invest abroad. The inflation is being exported to the other countries. And when they experience the inflation, it's very similar to what happened when Britain was the old power. One of the main reasons that the British Empire fell was because they tried to get America to cancel out its debt, to erase the debt, and America refused. So in the event that you have a default by the United States and China would not accept the repeal of the debt or the exoneration of the debt, you could see a similar process whereby the power and the ability of the American imperialist dollar-denominated system to dictate power throughout this system, which every nation, that all nation states control. The whole world is covered in nation states, and almost every nation state has an independent central bank whose primary holdings are foreign currencies, and the primary foreign currency they hold is dollar bills, which makes their own currency dependent upon the value of the foreign currency that they hold. China is 2 trillion, Japan is 1 point something trillion. The Arab regimes have another 1 trillion. And so what the process does is it creates their dependencies, because they hold so much debt. It's not in their best interest to have it all go sour at one time. But we do see, if we look at the phenomenon, that they are diversifying. They are changing their approach. They're trying to do it slowly so that they don't create a crash. What you're going to do, what you're probably going to see, is another crisis. And if there's another crisis, S&P, Standard & Poor's rating agency, just downgraded the dollar, which doesn't mean much, because Standard & Poor's had AAA ratings on subprime securities up until they crashed, when the majority of people knew they were worthless. They're really very much a representative of the financiers themselves. And they really want to force America into austerity measures, which is false, because America can basically print up all the money at once. So you don't really have a problem with debt. What you have is a problem, simultaneous occurrence of debt and imperialist overstretch. And with the imperialist overstretch, what you have is you have worsening conditions for people at home, which can create the kind of political machinations whereby there's an obstacle to war. And then, as we talked about in the beginning with the concept of nankusuha, if you cannot maintain all of these imperialist beaches or the outposts on the periphery, and you lose control in one area, what you allow is you allow your own destruction to be sown. So there will be no consequence of debt until there's an alternative that formulates. Now, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa just formed the BRICS Union, which is going to conduct trade in their own currencies. It's a major stepping stone towards developing such an alternative. And because the American entity has placed so much emphasis on the Middle East, on the Muslim world, and got embroiled in these long wars, the problem is that these other powers have been able to rise up. Now, they don't really represent any form of resistance and any form of major paradigmatic shift, but what's going on in Latin America is particularly interesting. Latin America has evicted almost all of the military bases. There's a couple potential military bases that could be formulating in Colombia, but Latin America has reestablished itself in sovereignty. They have the Banco de Sur, and they have Hugo Chavez developing some form of system, but altogether, I don't know how much they can pose a paradigmatic alteration. But that's essentially what happens. You look at what happened in America and their ability to separate in the 1850s and 60s from the assault of civil war created by financiers from afar, and they use creative policies based upon their own philosophical understandings, quite different than the ones coming from the old colonialist entity, to create a new system. That new system eventually grew to replace the old system. It's very similar to what happens. When empires rise, other empires fall. We don't really classify most of the Islamic system as an empire because it's fundamentally different. When we look at the perception of a person who experienced colonialism in Latin America or Africa, and we look at their experience with colonialism, and we ask the people today, do you think that colonialism, as Neil Ferguson would suggest, liberated you and developed you? Overwhelming 90+% of them would say no, absolutely not. Not the same true for the areas that were opened by Islam. We asked them about their Islamic identity, now that they've all converted and over the centuries accepted for the most part. And that's not true actually either, because you have the large Christian population in Egypt. You have, in India, you have a large Hindu population that continues to exist there, despite the fact that these regions were predominantly Muslim for many centuries. So that's testimony to the fact that Islam doesn't force itself by the sword, but testimony to the fact that Islam is not an imperialist entity akin to European colonialism and experiences in the imperialism associated with such expansions there, is that the majority of people that have ever been and had an Islamic identity, think of Chechnya, the Chechens and the what became part of Russia or the USSR, eventually they split away from the Ottoman Empire due to Christian intervention in those regions. Well, areas where there's any Islamic identity, no matter how shallow it was, and no matter the fact that there's been very limited Islamic practice in these regions for several decades, still, no matter where you go, no matter where Islam spread to, the people will fight and kill you before they lose the identity that was given to them by Islam. So that in and of itself is fundamentally different, and is a point that is never highlighted in the scholarship, but must be addressed. If Islam were merely the precursor to European colonialism, and if many people use the argument that imperialism and colonialism is a process, empires rise only to be replaced by others, but imperialism is essentially good, which is the argument made by Niall Ferguson, it's not necessarily the case. You have to look at the distinctions that were made by Rosa Luxemburg in regard to the nature of expansion under Islam, that they didn't uproot traditional systems, that they didn't extract everything, that they kept infrastructure development. They still tended to the development of infrastructure. And this is probably why there's no resentment of the expansion in the Islamic states, akin to the type of resentment of the colonialist experience suffered by Latin Americans and Africans. So eventually there's the only way that you'll see the dollar-denominated system go in full will be when there's the development of an alternative. Finance capitalists may initiate their own alternative because it is unsustainable, but the debt is not an issue until there comes a paradigmatic challenge to that system. So our role cannot be to bleed the economy to death. Our role must be a conscious policy of it's okay, the strategy of luring them, exposing the empire into wars because people are trying to break away from the system, even though they're in handfuls in their pockets, is a fine strategy. But there must be a coincident strategy of creating an alternative paradigm. And for us, the beauty is that where socialism failed but has continued to be perceived to be the only alternative, Islam offers something that's quite unique and quite capable of regenerating relationships amongst humanity that are fair and equitable, but that also don't stymie creativity and development, innovation. There's no reason to suggest why a country like Egypt couldn't separate itself from debt dependency by issuing its own bonds, couldn't then develop that bond market for infrastructural development projects, couldn't then use labor to provide a livable wage that would stimulate demand, boom the economy, unite the region, erase the serious consequences of Sykes-Picot. There's no reason to suggest that the Ummah couldn't do it. It just requires education. It requires a process of leadership. It requires understanding how change occurs. And it requires putting time in to care enough about historical processes to understand history so that similar mistakes aren't repeated. You can look at the fall of empires, and usually before there was a fiat empire, there was gold and silver standard empires that were based in coinage that was debased. And so inflationary consequences of the debasement and imperial overreach and overstretch of an empire are coincident to its fall. But that fall does not come until on the periphery there's a loss of ability to control. Because if empires need to constantly expand and then all of a sudden on the periphery somebody breaks away, then there's big problems. And that's why you'll see the ideological war play out to make sure that Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and other states like them don't represent a breakaway from the system, because that's when the debt counts. When there's no further markets to exploit, when there a segment of what has come into contact represents massive loss. There's capital flight, there's massive losses accrued in Egypt and Tunisia. And not only that, but there's no need to take out debt to go to recycle the process, because what they have in mind for Tunisia and Egypt is loans to make them debt dependent, but keep the dollar system afloat. They're going to take losses, but essentially they're going to be able to force policies that will create a massive stimulus that can be controlled by them, which will serve to be denominated in dollar bills and give yet another wave at, quote unquote, the accumulation of capital. So I hope that answers the question. And now We'll go on to the next. Inshallah. Can you provide resources for Vatican world? I don't think I said it was the world's biggest multinational company today, but if I did, I made a mistake. The Vatican is still one of the biggest holding companies. Of course, they're not transparent, so we don't know, but it's quite evident that they, through the tithe collections and through the traditional assets of the Vatican, do control an exorbitant amount of wealth. And there was a history in time, especially in the run-up to the success of the Crusades, when the Vatican and its bankers, the Venetians, were representative of the accumulation of almost all of European capital, because under the feudalist system, the peasants and the serfs had to pay a tribute to the princes and to the landed ownership class, and they were in turn taxed by the Vatican itself. And so this is certainly, I don't think we call it a traditional multinational, but certainly coming out of the Crusades and the interaction that the Knights Templars had in the Muslim world and their accumulation of setting up sort of financial centers and avenues of trade themselves, certainly the Vatican represents a substantial amount of holdings. And the fact that, you know, up until the Reformation period of Luther, that you had to pay for the atonement of sins, suggests that there was massive exploitation of the people. And because Christianity was the doctrine of Europe prior to secularism, and because the Vatican holding companies were formulated in a very similar way to like an investment fund or a sort of a holding company, if you will, then certainly they are a big multinational company. But today, with the rise of multinational corporations, if I said that still the Vatican is the world's biggest multinational company, then I would be mistaken, because the Vatican is suffering as well due to one disinterest in Catholics to pay the tithe, the conversion of Catholics to Protestantism, the decreasing role of the Vatican in international affairs, but still traditionally and through their connections to the mafia, they still represent a institution that still invests in holdings, but over time has become less and less relevant, but certainly largely responsible for the history of Europe and its domination. And it's their financiers were actually the Venetians, so they were in debt to financiers. Libya. I don't understand the question on Libya. It just says Libya with a question mark. Please elaborate. Eric Benjamin, as well as the resource about decolonization in Malaysia. Okay, most of what the decolonization process of Malaysia, the majority of that data can be found. Let me pull it up. I have it in my computer. The majority of the data from this era mentioned tonight in the discussion is from a book. I'm pulling up the title to it now, and I'll type it in. Very interesting book. And there's all kinds of studies in the reading packet. You can look at the data of economic policy under Mahathir ibn Mohammed. British business in post-colonial Malaysia, 1957 to 1970, by Nicholas J. White. So let me type that here. Something like this. By Nicholas J. White. Yep. And there's other studies. I have access to academic articles. As soon if possible, inshallah, I'll be releasing a paper that will be published about and it includes some information about Malaysia in it and the Indonesian economy. If you send me an email, I'll send it to you so you can look at the resources. I've studied a lot of what the IMF and World Bank have put out on Indonesia and Malaysia, but most of my sources for the discussion about the the independence era, decolonialization era, are from this book by Nicholas J. White. Very, very interesting read. Although he doesn't argue that. Yes, inshallah. Send me an email I'll send you the paper. Any more questions? I don't understand the one about Libya, Abdurrahman. How about, there's one more. Does the IMF loan out money in US dollars? For the most part. Of course, because the dollar is the global reserve currency, but increasingly they're starting to steer towards the standard drawing rights mechanism. The IMF is responsible for just making sure that debts are honored, that countries that are about to go into default implement policies that allow them to pay back their debts. The problem is that the majority of the places that the IMF is helping and assisting in bailing out, the reason that those countries went into default is because of the way that the financial speculators operate in the world. So rather than pay back the speculators, countries would be better off to default on their debt and then rebuild their economy. This class was recorded and it will be posted on YouTube inshallah very soon. You can watch, this is the week 6, so you can watch the other 5, or you can listen to the other 5 on YouTube. I just have to label the videos on the go to Islam Policy YouTube account. So, yeah, I'm tired. The IMF question is, you have to understand the IMF is not so much about making sure things are denominated in dollars as it is about advocating for policies that are conducive to dollar dominance. So, if there's no more questions, then we'll end tonight's discussion. I thank the few members that came for coming. Alhamdulillah, Jazakallah khair. It's always a pleasure. And please, inshallah ta'ala, keep me. My name is Yunus Abdullah Muhammad. Please keep me in your dua. I need people praying for me in these next few days, especially if you could remember me, inshallah ta'ala, that Allah keep me safe, my family safe, and protect me from any harm that may come my way, inshallah. It would be greatly appreciated. Eric Benjamin, I hope to get an email from you, brother. You seem very intelligent, and we'll communicate through that means. It's always a pleasure to meet new acquaintances, and oftentimes when you open a room and give a 3-hour discussion with only 4 individuals in it, and someone stays for the whole time, it says something about the character of the individual. So inshallah ta'ala, shoot me an email, maybe include something about yourself, where you're from, what you're interested in. Maybe there's an opportunity for us to continue to communicate. It's always nice to talk to interesting people and to meet new people, inshallah. Abdurrahman, thanks for coming again. Brother Ali, Muhammad Ayub, Jazakallah khair for coming, and all the others that have now left the room, have since been gone. We pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep us all firm upon His deen, that He does give the ummah an ability to understand the importance and imperativeness of such discussions, so that we can make Islam something real, something tangible, something that poses a threat or an alternative to contemporary imperialist domination. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect all of those that are sacrificing in any way, shape or form in the way of Allah, and that He protect the du'at and the mujahideen. Ameen. I do not live in New York anymore, Brother Ali, but I don't live in in New York. Allahumma ameen. Yeah, inshallah ta'ala, we'll be back in 2 weeks with week 7. I know there's 4 sessions left. I can't remember what the next session is, week 7. We're going to talk about the interference of the foreign capital and the bankers in the Middle East generally, I believe, and especially the role that they play in the Sharia-compliant finance industry. So you get a nice, very interesting and largely unknown and unidentified historical breakdown of HSBC that we talked about tonight, the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, and their history of intervention starting in China, going into Iran, and then intervening throughout the Middle East as one of the primary players in the international arena and representing largely the interests of European capital. I thank you all for joining us, and with that, tonight's discussion is over. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم. الحمد لله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.